So last time we stopped with course logistics. This is what I wanted to cover, start covering last time also, but now we'll cover it now. So we're going to talk about memory trends, challenges, and opportunities. The first part of the courses will be focused a lot on memory, since it's one of the major bottlenecks, as you will see in a little bit. But we will sprinkle other topics in between also. So let's start. I'll motivate memory in a different way right now. But these are 4 things that we're going to discuss relatively a lot during this course, especially in the first half, related to memory. Security, reliability, safety. You will see that especially later today. Energy efficiency, how to handle data well, how to be more data-centric. I think that's going to be very important. Low latency is very important. I think this is something that we're going to focus a lot on, especially with different applications that are coming. Latency is becoming very important. I was reading about these machine learning accelerators yesterday night, and I was thinking how you can make them even lower latency, because this is something that's really important. If you have a self-driving car, for example, you really want to be able to react to things extremely fast. If you're moving fast and if something comes in your view, how are you actually handling that, right? It's really all about latency at that point. Maybe you don't even care about energy efficiency at that point, because if you're not low latency, and if you cannot detect, for example, a pedestrian or something very quickly with your chip, with your machine learning chip, let's say, then you have a problem. You have a much bigger problem related to safety, right? So I think these things are actually relatively related to each other, latency and reliability and safety, because if you're not quick enough, you may cause security problems. But you're always limited by energy in terms of how fast you can be in a setting like that if you have a self-driving car, right? These are very, very real settings going into the future, and these requirements will become even worse going into the future, I think. We will want even lower latency, especially if we keep continuing to rely on computers in every aspect of our lives to make decisions. And if they're not good at making these decisions, or if they're not reliable for some reason, they will cause a lot of security, reliability, and safety issues, which we don't want in general. And they will be operating until extremely stringent conditions. So energy will become an even worse issue, because these computers will be distributed all across the place in the world, like robots, right? They will not be powered on somewhere. They will need to somehow be extremely energy efficient. They will need to maybe harvest energy from some source, and that's how they need to operate. So that's why I listed these as the top 3 things over here. But I will motivate things with some emerging applications starting right now. Is it a bit warm here? Is there a way to adjust the air conditioning? I have room ventilation. I press maximum. Did anything change? Maybe there's a phase. No, it's switched to a phase where it's maximum. That's the only option I have. I either press maximum or not press maximum. Not a lot of control. Maybe not a great user interface, right? This is very similar to computing interface, right? This is another computer or control interface, and I'm not sure if this is the best interface that we have for it. Anyway, let me know if it's still too hot. We should not be suffering from heat in September at this point in time, right? For sure. Okay, so keep these in mind. I think this is really real, and it's going to get worse. But I'm going to talk about this one. This is something that we've been working on for some time. That's why I like the topic. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but I'm going to use it as a motivator for why we need even more aggressive memory systems going into the future. Because some of the architectures that we need to design for genomics, medicine, and health, in particular genomics, as I will discuss, require very low latency and very high energy efficiency. And they require also security, reliability, safety, privacy guarantees, which I'm not going to even talk about right now. But let me start with this one. I think it's going to be an interesting motivator. It's a detour, as I say over here. It's not going to be the main subject of this particular lecture, but hopefully it'll motivate you to consider why we need better memory systems. And this is, so as a researcher, it's always good to dream if you're doing research, or if you're doing any creative activity, it's always good to dream. And this was our dream with one of my collaborators, Can Alkan, who was at the University of Washington, Genome Sciences Department at that time. We were doing a hike on Mount Rainier, which is a beautiful mountain very close to Seattle. And we were discussing issues in genomics and architecture. And this was one of the things that we were imagining, basically. Can we somehow create a device that's really small, that you can carry around with you, or the doctor can carry around with him or her, and they can sequence genomes and ask questions to the device. And the device replies very quickly, within a minute, let's say, like it gives answers to this sort of questions, like which of these DNAs does this DNA segment match with? This could be useful for various things, so that you can understand some species that you find around, or you can try to answer questions like this: what is the likely genetic disposition of this patient to this drug? Right? That way you can, if you're a doctor, you can quickly get the answer to this and decide which drug to administer to the patient. And you can do this very quickly. I mean, in the worst case, you could do it in a life-threatening situation, right? If you had this device, it could be magic for a doctor, I think. And maybe there are many, many other questions, of course. Of course, you can ask many questions here. And usually, technology is agnostic of your goal, right? If you enable the technology, you can ask good questions or bad questions. You can use it for good purposes or bad purposes. Whatever, we're not going to cover the ethics issues related to technology here, clearly. So these questions can be used for good or bad also, clearly, right? But anyway, we don't have, at the time we were dreaming this, we didn't have a device that looks like this. We were very far away from it, actually. Certainly there were devices that could sequence genomes, but not within a minute. And certainly the analysis of a genome took much, much longer than a minute. It's about 2 weeks or so. Right? And maybe even then it didn't give you very precise, very accurate answers at that time. Even right now we don't have those devices, but I will show you some pictures. So this is, I think, a very good activity. These are some applications that didn't exist before, and these applications require new architectures to think about. And I will show you that memory system is a big bottleneck in this sort of architecture. So I'm not going to go into detail. Actually, later we will have a lecture on accelerating genome analysis. Probably Mohammed will give that lecture if I'm not in town. If I'm in town, I will give that lecture. But basically, hopefully, how many of you had a biology class at some point in your lives? So you're familiar with this? ACTG? Okay, these are the 4 bases that constitute all of us. And you have these 4 base pairs, and these are real. This is actually a real chromosome from Henrietta Lacks. It's actually very interesting. There are interesting stories in biology, of course, like in every field. But this was, these were chromosomes taken from this lady without her consent. And this enabled a lot of research in understanding human genomes today. So think about, of course, privacy-related issues. Today you cannot do that, but in the 1950s, 60s, you can do that, right? Privacy is a very big concern today. And always there's another fundamental trade-off that spans fields, right? Privacy versus knowledge, or common knowledge. How do you actually bridge that trade-off? I think of this as privacy versus performance trade-off, right? You want to get to some answer quickly, so you want that performance, but it violates some privacy. So there's always a trade-off between privacy and performance. Okay, anyway, you can read about Henrietta Lacks if you're interested. But that's not the purpose of this lecture. So we clearly want to sequence a DNA and understand its contents before we can build this device. So in DNA sequencing, the goal is really to understand the complete sequence of these bases or base pairs. Because it's a double-stranded helix, right? DNA is a double-stranded helix, so you have base pairs that are opposite of each other. So you really want a complete sequence of these ACTGs in a DNA. The problem is, or the challenge is, there is no device or no machine that takes someone's DNA as input, and that gives you the complete sequence as output. So human DNA, for example, is about 3.2 billion base pairs. There is no machine that takes your cells and gives you, this is your 3.2 billion base pair DNA. People have tried to construct it, they were not successful. I think this is a very difficult task if you're interested in this technology. Trying to construct such a machine is great, but all machines in the end are choppers. In the end, what they do is they basically chop the DNA into some pieces, big or small, as we will see in a little bit, and they identify these relatively small pieces. For example, some of the most highest throughput machines chop the DNA into pieces of 250, 300 base pairs. So you have this 3.2 billion base pair DNA, and the machine chops it into pieces of 300 base pairs. 300 is very small compared to 3 billion, right? So you can imagine, now you have a task at hand. How do you reconstruct these pieces? How do you stitch them again together so that you reconstruct the entire 3.2 billion base pair DNA? So this is a very computational problem, because technology gives you these small reads, let's say, or fragments, as they're called, fragments of the DNA. Your job is to reconstruct the DNA. So basically, these machines give you these small pieces, but they do not tell you how they fit together. They do not tell you how exactly which 300 base pair follows which other 300 base pair. Right? So now you have a bigger problem, because you have these 300 base pairs. They may actually have a lot of matches in the 3 billion base pair human DNA. Right? Hopefully this is clear. You will see this pictorially in a little bit also. So this is a very computationally heavy task. There are some new technologies actually that are interesting. This is an area where it's also really good to understand the technology itself. There are some new technologies that are interesting. They give you, for example, 300 or 400 base pairs, fragments, but they also tell you how some of those are linked together within a small vicinity. But they don't tell you within the grander vicinity. So this is you may get some linkage information, which one follows which one, but you may not get complete linkage information. Of course, there's another aspect to this. The machines also have errors. They don't tell you exactly what those 300 base pairs are. That makes it even worse, right? Because now you got this 300 base pair. You cannot trust it's exactly correct, because the machine has some error rate. Sometimes it thinks it's an A, but it's really a T. And that error rate depends on the machine also. So what happens is that amplifies the computational complexity of the problem, because whenever you get a 300 base pair, you cannot fully trust it, so you need to do the sequencing many, many times. And then you need to build confidence in terms of, and each time you do the sequencing, you construct something, and you need to build confidence over many sequences as to where these different base pairs are. So of course, I'm not giving you the full algorithm. As we will see later, the full algorithm is actually very long, not today. But hopefully this gives you an idea of the computational complexity of the problem. And in the end, it's very much memory bound, because whenever you actually need to process things, you need to go to memory many, many times. Of course, we would like to minimize that memory access too. Okay, so this is a pictorial view of the problem. So think of, if you have cats, you may imagine the cats playing with yarn balls like this. But basically, think of this as a DNA. And what the machines do is they go through this with some chopping mechanism. It could be a scissor. That's one way of chopping, right? There could be many chopping mechanisms. And then in the end, you get some little pieces of this one or this one. And the goal is to reconstruct the entire yarn ball, basically. And this is actually a very interesting, similar scenario in real life. In real life, whenever you get some sample, you don't just get sample from a single DNA, because there may be a lot of DNA around it, right? It could be different types of bacteria together. So you actually run into this situation a lot. Anyway, so let's say these are the choppers, basically. This is a slightly old picture, but this basically shows what are the machines that people have developed, and these are real machines. This is an interesting one. This is one of the fastest ones, highest throughput machines. This is second generation. You can see that it's huge. Well, it's not huge in the picture, but you can imagine that it's huge, right? But you can see, for example, this gives you some perspective over here. It's similar to that. And this is about $3 million, give or take something. It's very accurate. So it gives you small reads, small fragments, 300 base pairs, let's say. It gives you them very accurately, around 99%, maybe higher. But even that 1% error rate is not good, because you have so many of these, right? So this is a very different machine compared to, I don't know, this, and compared to this. So this is very interesting. You can see that this is small. You can keep it in your hand. You can buy it for $1,000, $2,000, and you can actually do your sequencing at home if you know how to do it. This didn't exist when we were dreaming. We were dreaming in 2006, 7, let's say, but actually 7. But we started discussing in 2006. But basically, we believed in the technology. So as an architect, it's always good to believe in the technology also. You may be wrong at some point, but if you're right, then you can basically enable the technology. So we believed in this technology, at the time, at that point, somebody would develop this sort of embedded devices. And it's always a good thing to believe in, especially if things are scaling very well with Moore's law, for example. And remember, we discussed Moore's law at some point. People think Moore's law is dead. I don't believe Moore's law is dead. As you can see with the Cerebras chip that we discussed last time, right? You have this huge wafer scale engine. We just haven't explored how we can make Moore's law scale much better. Anyway, as long as people keep putting more transistors on a chip, and that keeps being economically good, then Moore's law is not dead. Okay, and I haven't seen evidence as to whether it's dead yet. So this is basically, let me go back to the point. This is very different from this machine over here. This machine gives you read lengths of 1 million base pairs or so. So 1 million versus 300. This sounds better, right? Because now you have longer sequences, and you have, hopefully you have a less computationally complex problem. Now the downside over here is the error rates are much higher. It's about 10 to 15%, let's say. So you need to do a lot more sequencing to get this, to get better confidence in this one. So you have a trade-off. There's no, essentially, all of these machines produce data with different properties. Okay, I'm spending more time than I expect. But any questions so far? There will be a lecture related to this more later on. But if you have questions right now, feel free to ask. I want this class to be more interactive, as you know. Okay, clearly these machines enabled a lot of progress in terms of genome analysis. You probably have heard of the Human Genome Project. I don't know if this number is actually correct, but these are actually numbers in terms of some other years' dollars. So people spend a lot of effort to sequence the human genome. And even now, we don't have complete sequencing of human genome. We have about 80% of it complete. There's still a 20% that's may not be fully complete. So we still need to do work in this area. And this is another picture that's interesting. Basically, the number of genomes that are being sequenced has been increasing, as you can see, very fast, which means that the data that we're producing in this area is increasing very fast. Now you may ask the question, why? Why? Because the cost of sequencing a genome has reduced significantly. And this picture shows you that cost. This is a very famous graph that was done by NIH, National Institute of Health in the United States. But if you look at the years over here, 2001 to 2015, this blue curve shows the cost per raw megabase of DNA sequence. What is the cost of sequencing? And this white curve is Moore's law. So Moore's law gives you less costly transistors over time. As you can see, DNA sequencing cost is reducing much faster than the transistor cost is decreasing, which means that you can produce a lot more data. And it has reduced significantly over here. This was when those big machines that I mentioned were actually put in place in production a lot. Those machines were very powerful in reducing the cost of sequencing. Even though they were expensive, they were very high throughput. You're able to actually process many DNAs, even though they were expensive. And if you see, there's another inflection point over here. It's around 2014 or so, and that's when the third, let's say, nth generation sequencing was introduced, which is really these small devices, nanopore type of devices, that reduced the cost again a lot. So basically, takeaway is the cost of DNA sequencing is getting lower and lower. As a result, we have a big data problem in terms of DNA in terms of DNAs that we have sequenced. The question is, how do we analyze them, right? We can actually, a lot of countries have projects in terms of sequencing genomes. Again, this could be used for good or bad, right? They could take their citizens' genomes and do whatever they want with it. I think citizens should be more careful in general, but again, that's a personal choice. But they're doing it regardless. There are big projects in many countries in terms of sequencing genomes. Okay, so basically the takeaway is we can build these machines reasonably well today. They're much better than before, and the cost is reducing and reducing. They're not perfect. If they were perfect, maybe computational problems would be less, but they're not perfect. As a result, we need to somehow figure out what we do with the sequenced genomes. And that's where genome analysis plays a role. Basically, genome analysis is all of this coming from sequencing. After you get the sequences, how do you actually figure out how they fit together? I'll talk about the read mapping process briefly. And then after that, there's also analysis that you can do. Once you figure out what the genome really looks like, can you actually ask other questions to it, basically? How is this genome different from some other genome? and many other questions, and that could lead to scientific discovery, that could lead to improvements in health. Okay, so this is another question, for example. If I give you a bunch of sequences, you can tell me where they're different and where they're the same. Right? Clearly, this is a computational problem. If, as a human, you cannot do it probably, right? Or if you can do it, then let me know. Maybe machines can use the algorithms that you have in your head. Okay, this is another picture. I'm not going to go through this. You can read a lot of material that people have written on the benefits of this in terms of scientific literature. Okay, this is a picture that I like. Mohammed, who's a TA in this course, who's not here. Is he here? Okay, I don't see him. He constructed this slide as part of his PhD proposal. He was my PhD student. He's now a postdoc here. But it's nice to see that people are actually very similar to each other, even though they may look extremely different, right? In many ways, actually, pretty much in all ways, they may look extremely different. You may not agree with them, but this is also interesting. Maybe sometimes humans are closer to bananas than something else, right? Okay. Anyway, you can have fun with this also. So this could also lead to discovery of new organisms that you've not encountered, right? This is basically if you have some short sequences, can you identify what this particular organism that you just sequenced looks like, so that you can actually place it in the tree of organisms. So there is a lot of graph processing that goes into this sort of algorithms. Again, I'm not going to go through this, but you can find these online. Maybe when we do the longer lecture, we'll talk about graph processing later in this course. So analyzing graphs and similarity of different components of graphs is very important, not just for social networks, which is built on graphs, not just for encyclopedias, for example, like Wikipedia is based on a lot of graphs and graph algorithms, but also for genomics. There's a lot of graph processing that goes on over here. Okay, basically, I think the takeaway I've already said is that sequencing is not a big problem today, but we're bottlenecked by how we computationally analyze and understand those sequences. And this is some numbers based on some technology assumptions and based on some analyses that you do. You can see that you can sequence a lot of bases per minute. This number has already increased, so take this with a grain of salt. But you cannot process much of at the same bandwidth, because we're limited by the computational algorithms as well as architectures that we have today. So this is really a problem that spans across the stack. We need better algorithms. We also need better architectures for it. So okay, let me delve in a little bit more into the problem so that I can give you a little bit more insight into the stuff that is being done in the area from my personal experience. And then I'll motivate the memory problem. Basically, the first problem that you get is this. You have these subsequences. You need to construct the entire genome from these many subsequences. I'll call them reads, or I'll use fragments as well. The terminology in bioinformatics is a little bit unfortunate because it's very heavy. When you go into bioinformatics, it's like chemistry. You get flooded with a lot of terms. So don't let that scare you. It's better to digest it a little bit over time. So reads, fragments, subsequences, they're all the same term. Basically, we need to reconstruct it. What does this mean? This means that we need to map many short DNA fragments to a known reference genome with some differences allowed. So this is one particular problem called the read mapping problem or read alignment problem. Basically, logically, DNA looks like this. Physically, it looks like this. A chopper goes through this and chops it into small pieces, reads. And the task in read mapping is you already know a reference genome. Assume that you already, with a lot of pain, constructed this reference genome, and you already know it. Read alignment basically says, I want to match as best as possible each of these reads to a reference genome so that I can reconstruct what I have over here. Make sense? This is one problem. It's actually an easier problem compared to what's called assembly. Assembly problem is, how do you construct a reference genome without having a reference genome? Right? You basically chop something and you don't have anything to compare to. How do you reconstruct that? That is a lot harder. There are a lot of graph algorithms that are being developed, but I'm not going to talk about that right now. Maybe we'll have some lecture related to this. If John is doing some work in the back over there on assembly, so he may have some short lecture about this later on. So we're solving even the easier problem right now. We're assuming that the reference genome exists. Okay, and it does exist, at least in humans, for example, we have a reference genome that exists. If a reference genome doesn't exist, you can still start with this. For example, you basically have a banana, you compare it to a human genome, and you quickly find out that there are a lot of differences, right? So you may not get a perfect thing at the end, but you at least figure out where things may somewhat map to. But what you get in the end may not be very useful if the genomes are very different from each other. But now we're assuming that there's a reference genome, and we've sequenced some humans' DNA, and we're mapping to it so that we can reconstruct my DNA compared to the reference genome. Okay, so it's not going to be a perfect match like this, because my DNA is different from your DNA, and your DNA is different from someone else's DNA, right? So there will be differences. In fact, those differences are the most important parts to focus on, because those may be indicators of, for example, some disease, or indicators of why we look different, or indicators of our susceptibility to some sort of drug or not. So those differences are actually very, very important. And whenever you're doing this mapping, read mapping, it's good to be as sensitive as possible to those differences so that you can capture a lot of those differences as much as possible. Okay, so I think this is clearly it's challenging because you have very large number of base pair reads to map. Okay, so how is this done today? So one simple way of doing this is you get this 300 base pair read, and you basically compare it to every 300 base pairs that you see in the reference genome. Right? That's a lot of comparisons, right? 300 base pairs, and then you go through 3 billion base pairs. And what's worse is you don't want a perfect match, you want an approximate match. So it's not a perfect string matching problem, it's really an approximate matching problem. So this is a special name. Last time we talked about Hamming distance. Hamming distance gives you how much different you are in terms of when you compare two strings of the same length, in how many characters they differ, right? That's not exactly what we want here, although that could be useful also. We want something stronger. Now what is that? That's called edit distance. It's really the minimum number of edits, insertions, deletions, or substitutions that are needed to make the read exactly match the reference segment. This is actually interesting. This is another fundamental concept, I think. It's especially used in bioinformatics, but it could be used in other areas also whenever you're doing approximate string matching. You can think of, you have two different strings, and you're really aligning them to each other so that you're trying to find the minimum number of edits to match each other. Why? Because of some mutation, one of the bases may be removed in one of the either in the reference genome or the read that you have, right? And this the insertion, deletion, or substitution, they all have different meanings biologically. They also can depend on the machines as well, which I'm not going to talk about. So the interesting thing is these can be caused by the machine errors, or they could be caused by some biological differences that you have between the reference genome and the read. Let's take an example over here. I like this example. You have Netherlands versus Switzerland, right? It's not a football game, soccer game, but this is a string comparison that you have. Assume that this is your reference, Switzerland, and this is the read that you got when you chopped off somebody's DNA. You got Netherlands. Now this is the edit distance that you have between them. You can see that it's very different from Hamming distance, right? We're not really comparing exactly. So if we were doing Hamming distance, we would be comparing T and I together. Now we're not doing that. We're trying to answer the question, what does it require, what edits do I require in Netherlands so that it can match Switzerland with as few edits as possible? You can see that these NE and SW, they don't match. And there's a T that kind of matches, but to be able to find that, you need to look forward, kind of, right? And if you want to make that T match, you need to also have a deletion in Netherlands. So this I should be deleted in Netherlands. Right? Hopefully this gives you some insight into how are we trying to match these things. And you can see that this Airland over here matches clearly. So you have 6 characters that match, but in order to make them match, this should be a mismatch. Right? And then the last character is an insertion. In the read Netherlands, we have an insertion of S. We don't have that in Switzerland. Essentially, this is the minimum number of edits that you have between Netherlands and Switzerland. So there are 3 mismatches, 1 deletion in Netherlands and 1 insertion in Netherlands. Make sense? Has anyone looked at edit distance before? Is this a familiar concept? Okay, some people have, but not many people. In what context did you study this?
Algorithms and data structure. It was called sequence alignment.
Okay, exactly. This is exactly a sequence alignment problem. In particular, this is a local sequence alignment problem. And there's also a global sequence alignment problem that you have with the global genome, right? So there are different algorithms that you can use for both. But yeah, where did you study it? Here? At ETH?
This was at my home university in Denmark.
In Denmark, okay, interesting.
DTU.
Okay. Who else? Where did you study it?
University of Washington.
Okay.
It was part of our algorithms class as an example of dynamic programming.
Okay, exactly. So I was going to get to that. So how do you actually calculate this? That's the next question. Again, I'm not going to go through this. If you're really interested, you should take a algorithms class or a dynamic programming class. So this is not as easy to calculate as Hamming distance, right? Hamming distance, you compare each string, each character independently. But now you have a problem here. How do you know this Erland is going to match if you don't look ahead, in a sense? Right? So you really need to have form a dynamic programming matrix, and this is a perfect example of dynamic programming to do. So I'm not going to, later when we have the longer lecture, we're going to talk about dynamic programming a little bit, although we're not going to go into the theory of it like you would do in an algorithms class. Basically, you really need to, this is a very complicated process, let me put it that way. In the end, it's a lot of calculation, it's a lot of irregular computation that you need to do, and even doing this matching takes a long time. Okay, but imagine doing this for all possible 300 base pair locations in the 3 billion base pair reference genome. Not so good. As a result, we will see the consequences. So basically, the problem is actually a little bit more complicated. How can we find all mappings efficiently? You need to find many mappings of each read. So for example, you have this Netherlands, and you want to find all possible places where it can match. And you also have a threshold usually. Your threshold is how many edits do you really allow? So in this case, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 edits. There are 5 edits between these two strings. Your threshold may be 4. 4 means that if I have at most 4 edits, I'm going to consider that Netherlands may match this location, which means that in this case it doesn't, right? But of course, as you this is called edit distance threshold. If your edit distance threshold is higher, you will get more matches in the 3.2 billion base pair genome. If your edit distance threshold is lower, you'll get fewer matches. Now this has implications, of course. Sometimes you want to get more matches so that you can actually understand where you could potentially differ. And ideally, I think you want to get more matches as much as possible, of course within reason. But sometimes we don't know what is within reason in science also, because we're also discovering how much match is indicative of something versus some other thing, right? So this is actually very interesting, because the computing environment that you build to make that edit distance threshold as high as possible can enable discoveries that you may not imagine before, because people can test these things with higher edit distance thresholds. Okay, if you don't fully understand that, that's okay. It takes a while to digest these things. Okay, basically, you want to find all mappings efficiently, and you want to tolerate small variances and errors in each read. As I said, this edit distance threshold. How can we efficiently map each read with up to E errors present? And we would like to ideally increase E as much as possible. And you need to map each read very fast. As I discussed, performance is important, especially if you want to build this as an embedded device, right? Okay, so let me give you my personal story very quickly. I'm not going to go through these in detail because we're going to have a lecture later on related to the algorithms and architectures. You'll see the detailed ideas better. But let me give you the high level of it. So when we first started, we actually published this paper in Nature Genetics. And this is a read mapper, essentially. It's a different read mapper from what was the state of the art at that time. Our goal was to really find all possible mappings of a read, basically to have a very sensitive mapper, and have a mapper that can actually increase E as much as possible. That was our goal at that time. And I think this is still one of the best mappers if your goal is that. Some of the mappers that are employed in the field, they can be very quick, like the BLAST mapper, but they're not very good at tolerating these E, or increasing the E as much as possible. Of course, the world is changing, so there's a lot of algorithmic development to be done in those mappers also. Okay, so if you have a mapper like this or some other mapper, the execution time breakdown looks like this usually. Essentially, most of the time is really spent on this read alignment or edge distance computation, because it's a very heavy dynamic programming mechanism, and that takes a lot of time. So the next question is, of course, if you want to, and that's essentially why we have this bottleneck that I showed you earlier. Most of the time you're spending on this dynamic programming algorithms. So of course, now if you have a problem like this, most of the time is spent on dynamic programming, you can have many solutions, right? Maybe we can talk about some potential solutions. What would you do if you were designing a system where your goal is to do this as fast as possible, and more than 90% of the time is spent on edit distance computation through dynamic programming? What would you do? I'll take ideas. I can maybe substitute it over here. Any thoughts? Yes?
I guess make specialized hardware for that.
For dynamic programming? Yes, exactly. So one thing is you can make a specialized hardware design, something that can accelerate edit distance computation, right? How would you do that?
We have to research into it, but yeah.
With what?
We have to research into it further.
I agree. Yeah, you need to understand the problem if you want to make if you want to design a specialized accelerator. Exactly. Basically, you really need to understand what's going on with edit distance computation and design a specialized accelerator. Maybe on an FPGA, maybe on an ASIC device, maybe in memory computation. This may actually be a good fit depending on what do you do. But yes, that's one option. What else? Yes?
Parallelize it.
Parallelize it. Okay, yes, that's a good one also. Parallelize the edit distance computation, right?
Yeah.
And actually, you actually have a lot of parallelism, right? Because you're doing some of these edit distance computation independent of each other. And that's actually something that people have pursued as well. You basically send this on a cloud and parallelize it on many machines. Eventually, you're bottlenecked by collecting the responses back from many of those machines. But you can do a good parallelization actually.
If one of them match, then like it's fine. We don't care about those who don't match.
Not necessarily. So the problem is interesting because some parts may match and some other parts, yeah, you don't care about those that don't match. I agree with that, but there may be many matches. So in the end, it's not completely parallel. There are parts that are really serial also. But that's a very good point. So you can parallelize. So there are two kinds of parallelization, I think. You can parallelize these different edit distance computations. So you have actually there are three kinds of parallelization, I think. One is you have many reads, right? You can do them completely independently, hopefully, and then later stitch them together. You have a single read that you're comparing to many parts. That's the second type of parallelization. And you have a single read comparing to a single string in the reference genome. That's the hardest thing to parallelize, probably. The other ones are relatively parallel, but this one is the hardest thing to parallelize. In the end, you're bottlenecked by this last one. You can parallelize everything else, but you will be bottlenecked by a single comparison that you do. But that's parallelization is in general a good direction. If you have an embedded device, you may not have a lot of parallelization resources. If you're in a cloud, maybe yes. But that comes at the cost of energy and complexity also. What else? Is there good ideas? Yes?
Maybe some machine learning on the base pairs. Like you input the 300 base pairs into machine learning, and then you would have like a neural network that could give like an idea of where it could be in the complete genome.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I'm not sure if anyone has pursued that in a lot of detail, but I like this out-of-the-box idea. The question is, I don't know how to construct that. Of course, there needs to be research in that. Like your colleague said, how do you construct that neural network that gives you somehow the input? And that neural network training needs to be done somehow. And to be able to do the training, I think you're back to square one. Maybe. But I like that thinking style. Is there some other way of doing the mapping as opposed to going through all of this edit distance computation, right?
Just a way to prioritize where you look for
Okay, I like that one. So that's actually coming to similar to what I'm going to describe, basically, just to prioritize where you look. Maybe you have some agent that you query first, and that agent tells you, oh, this part is going to match and this part is not going to match. And that could be built as a neural network, let's say, as a machine learning agent, or that could be built with some heuristics as well. So the idea you're getting into is filtering of the locations. You have this 300 base pair read. Can I quickly decide whether this part is going to match or not match? And if my filter tells you, oh, it's not going to match, I'm not going to even bother doing the set distance computation. So that's going to be very similar to the idea that I'm going to discuss. But I think doing it through machine learning could be another potential possibility. What else? I like this brainstorming. Good.
Maybe use a hashing function to
Okay.
optimize the amount of comparison.
Okay, how would you do that? So basically, you're suggesting something similar, maybe. Is that correct?
Yeah.
For the filtering part? Use a hashing function in the filter,
Yeah.
such that if the hash indicates, oh, this is definitely not going to match because of some huge threshold difference,
So it's
then you don't.
approximate hashing function.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Actually, that's going to be similar to one of the ideas. Actually, one of the ideas that I'm not going to describe in detail proposes a metric, which you could consider a hash. It's called shifted Hamming distance. It basically tries to get a quick idea of by doing some sort of Hamming distance comparisons between strings. It tries to get a quick idea of whether these strings are going to match or mismatch. And if you get a very high threshold difference, that means that it's not going to match, so you don't do the complicated edit distance comparison, because Hamming distance is much faster compared to edit distance. These are good ideas. What else? There are more ideas, actually. Yes?
I'm wondering if maybe supercomputing could be used to maybe pre-compute some known patterns in the genome, like smaller genomes,
Mhm.
and then that pre-computed information could be used to maybe filter, as you put it, some sort of inputs, and point it towards one or the other part of the whole genome, which would maybe potentially lower the time required to actually compute the whole 302 billion.
Okay.
Or the amount of pairs.
So you're also proposing a filter that can do this quickly,
Yeah.
but you train this filter.
Maybe using
with-
a machine which is like specialized for parallel actions, like like a supercomputer. Maybe not sure if it has been pursued.
Yeah, I'm not sure also. I think people have looked at it, but building a filter with a supercomputer could be interesting. Of course, it really depends on the algorithms that you have in the end.
Yeah, something can be more or less
Yeah.
parallel in that way.
Yeah. I think the difficulty in that case may be how representative are your small pieces.
Well, yeah, you could,
Because you don't want to have a filter that says this is not going to match when it's going to match. Right.
yeah, definitely it would need to be like a large sample in order to confidentially, or to have a high confidentiality in not
Confidence, yeah, confidence, sure.
High confidence in his match.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. These are good ideas. What else? Although these are basic ideas to, of course, do more research on. That's good, but this is the kind of mindset that I would like to instill in a computer architecture class. You're missing some parts of the stack. I think we've covered only some parts of the stack. Remember the stack picture, going from problems to electrons? Where else can you tackle the problem? Actually, I don't think you're missing. I think filtering is really an algorithmic change also, but there may be other algorithmic changes, right? Any thoughts? Or you can change the electrons so that they can do this better. That's going to be a tough sell probably for some time. So maybe designing better dynamic programming algorithms could be another one, right? If dynamic programming is taking so much time, can you do that much better? That's not easy because there's a lot of work in that area. And actually there's a lot of fundamental algorithmic work to try to cut down the effort on dynamic programming, because you're not always doing useful work when you're processing this dynamic programming matrix. Can you do that? Can you cut that work down quickly? Any other ideas? No? I'm sure if you think more, you'll come up with more. That's a good problem to think about ideas on. So maybe I'll continue. Okay, so basically we've already discussed this idea, and this was our idea also when we first started looking at this. Can we somehow design something that can quickly filter out things that are not going to match, so that you don't do these edit distance computations that are useless? The question is, of course, how you do these, design this filter. This is called minimizing costly approximate string comparisons. Basically, getting rid of dynamic programming as much as possible. In my opinion, if you follow this sort of approach, then the goal is twofold. Design a filter that's very quick, that can quickly reject things that are not going to match. And if things are going to match, now you need to do the dynamic programming. How can you make that much more efficient? Right. So there are two pieces. But we focused a lot on the filtering part. Again, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but later we'll discuss in a longer lecture. So this was actually a pure software algorithmic change. This is what this work does is it tries to design a filter, a hierarchical mapper. The first part is filter. Of course, the question is, how do you do the filtering? And one way of doing filtering is exploiting the structure of the human genome. So I'll give you the basic idea of it at a very high level. You form an index of the reference genome, and the reference genome index tells you, basically given a very small substring, let's say 12 base pairs long, it gives you all possible locations where this 12 substring appears, 12 base pair long substring appears. Now, using that information, you can quickly decide whether something will match or not match a possible location, right? Basically, it's like a database index in a sense. And you can use that information to actually guess whether a fragment that is 300 base pairs long will actually be matching a particular vicinity, right? For example, if you have a 300 base pair long string, and if you know where each of those 12 base pair long substrings are, you can quickly query, let's say even randomly, I'm just making this up, it's not random in this paper, but you can quickly query, okay, I have this 12 base pair long substring, I know all the possible locations for it, and I have this other 12 base pair long substring, I know all the possible locations for it. Is there some overlap between them? And this can be very parallel compared to dynamic programming. And quickly, you can find out that if there is no overlap, you can reject that part, saying that these are not going to, you're not going to find these in this vicinity. And you can actually get rid of a lot of the reference genome. You can get rid of the analysis of a lot of the reference genome that way. Yes?
Doesn't that depend on our error tolerance, for example?
Exactly. So yeah, exactly. So you need to take into account error tolerance, and that's handled in the paper. So that error tolerance makes things more complicated, certainly. It's not as simple as that. But it makes everything more complicated, including dynamic programming. Okay, so this is one idea. Of course, there are other ideas, but you can take a look at the paper. So this is a pure software algorithm that basically speeds up the mapper by, let's say, 10 to 20x, just with software changes. So algorithmic changes are usually a good idea whenever you start solving a problem. So hardware accelerators should come when you don't have a last resort, in a sense. Of course, while you're doing a hardware accelerator, you should also explore the algorithmic changes. But there's always a question, if you're an architect of a system, should I design a hardware accelerator or should I pursue algorithmic changes, right? Or should I pursue parallelization, for example? Because you may design a hardware accelerator and that can give you great benefits, but your hardware accelerator may become obsolete with the next generation processor because that has a lot of parallelism in it, and somebody who's parallelized their algorithm much better can do much better than your hardware accelerator. And you've spent a lot of time designing this hardware accelerator, right? So hardware accelerator, I think, should come later in the process when you're running out of ideas in terms of how to accelerate an algorithm. Okay, and then later we looked into, this is what I mentioned earlier, basically it's like of a hash, like one of you talked about. Basically, is there a quick way of doing this filtering by comparing these strings in an approximate manner? So edit distance computation gives you complete information, right? What is the how do these two strings differ from each other, and what are the exact differences? Is it a mismatch, is it a substitution, is it a deletion? And you want all that information because that information gives you insight into the biological differences. All of them may have different meanings. But if you're designing a filter, you don't want complete information, right? All you want to do is quickly decide, very, very quickly decide whether you'll have a match or not. So maybe you can design different metrics to compare two substrings with. And this paper essentially does that. Can you actually use Hamming distance and maybe do multiple Hamming distances such that you get a quick idea of whether these two strings match or mismatch with each other? And that's essentially the idea. And if you do that, you can actually do a lot of bitwise operations that can be parallelized very well with the SIMD, single instruction multiple data instructions that you have in an ISA. On a GPU also, but we did this with Intel SSE and AVX extensions in this paper. And you actually get about 3x performance improvement compared to the best algorithm that was proposed for this. I like this work. We'll talk about that later on. This is a good example of hardware-software co-design also. You have this SIMD accelerator that's very good at doing bulk bitwise operations. Maybe not huge bulk bitwise, but some bitwise operations. Can you take advantage of that by developing a metric that your algorithm, that your problem can take advantage of? Okay. And then later, we went into designing FPGA-based algorithms. This FPGA-based design actually accelerates the alignment using something similar to shifted Hamming distance. But this can actually be done in very parallel, similar to what you discussed basically. You can actually parallelize all of this in FPGA. And this also improves performance by another 10x, another order of magnitude. And if you're interested, you can read this. Mohammed will give a lecture on this for sure, since this is part of his PhD thesis, as you can see. If you're doing a PhD, you're the expert in the areas, and there should be no one better than you who could talk about your work, in a sense. That's why I think Mohammed is the best person to talk about it. And then, of course, he did all the other works in his PhD that accelerated things. So you can see that this is, of course, I don't expect you to understand all of this, but this gives you an idea of how much you can parallelize the different filtering mechanisms. And there's a lot of detail on how you design the FPGA. But the good thing is you can download all the source code of it and you can test it on your own. This is actually very important, I think, going forward in science. Unfortunately, there are some conferences that don't like opening up their source code. I think the future is all open, and we really should open up the source code, both in hardware and software, as much as possible. Of course, there are circumstances under which this cannot be done, right? If you're a company, you don't necessarily want to open up your source code. You should still be able to publish. There should be provisions for that, I think. I don't believe in very strict rules from that perspective. Otherwise, you will actually disable progress if you're too strict. But in general, I think people should be encouraged to open up their source code going forward. So now that the source code is open, anyone can download and test these ideas. Okay, so this is actually newest work. I'm not going to talk about this newest work. This is Mohammed's newest work. He'll probably have a longer lecture about this. This actually improves read mapping by another order of magnitude, let's say. I'm just giving you basic results. Of course, the results depend on the input set that you have, the problems you have. Okay, so why am I telling you all of this? Basically, in the end, the problem was heavily bottlenecked by data movement. This gatekeeper FPGA performance, this is the first FPGA-based alignment filter, is limited by DRAM bandwidth. That's true for shifted Hamming distance on SIMD. Basically, you have the best software algorithms that you designed, at least at that point in time, and they're bottlenecked by memory. So the solution, one of the solutions at least, is to look into processing data inside the memory. So we're designing these engines that are bringing data into the accelerator so that they can process the data. Why don't we put the accelerator inside the memory? That's the idea over here. Of course, as you've guessed, even these accelerators require changes to both the algorithm and the hardware. Once you go into processing in memory, you're really changing the paradigm, because you're really not moving the data to a processor, but moving the processor computation to the data itself. So you really need to design mapping and filtering algorithms to fit processing in memory. And there's some work in this area. I think going forward, the work needs to be even more in this area. But this is one example of really rethinking the algorithms for read mapping so that they can be better done inside the memory technology itself. And again, we will discuss this later on, but this problem is very nicely parallelizable inside the memory. But you really need to rethink how you structure how you represent the genome so that you can take advantage of the parallelism that you have inside memory. This will become more clear later on. Okay, so let me do a quick recap. Essentially, what we've followed so far is really two key principles. We want to exploit the structure of the genome to minimize computation. I think of this as more algorithmic changes, algorithmic and structural changes. You want to do as much software change as possible so that you minimize computation. And also, once you're limited by what other changes you can imagine, you change the hardware, exploit the structure of the underlying hardware to maximize performance and efficiency. So this is really algorithmic part, and this is algorithmic plus acceleration part. Essentially, what I've described so far is really an algorithm architecture co-design for DNA read mapping. And what is the end result? The end result is you speed up read mapping by, let's say, 300x, sometimes more, which is not bad, but it's maybe not enough, right, as we will see in a little bit. And you also improve the accuracy, but I'm not going to talk about that. So we're going to take a break after we're done with the bioinformatics part of the lecture. But this is another work that I would recommend if you're interested in this area. This work analyzes what happens after you get the sequences from this device, after you get the reads from this device. Actually, even before you get the reads, there's a pipeline associated with it. So this is so far we've been talking about this part of the pipeline. But once you, so this is the Nanopore device. Let me give you a little bit more on the Nanopore device. The technology here is different from the high throughput sequencing that we've discussed. Basically, you pass the DNA through a nanoscale hole. While the DNA passes through this nanoscale hole, the device measures the current perturbations that you have. And it basically correlates the current that it measures with the ACTG essentially. So there are different current measurements that you get for different base pairs. And this is called base calling. You basically compare the current, this raw signal data, and try to classify the current that you measure into ACTG. Now you can imagine that this is a nice machine learning type of problem, right? And actually, a lot of machine learning tools are employed. You can see that there are a bunch of tools over here. A lot of them are, you can guess, deep nano, right? That's a deep neural network that's employed in this one. So it turns out this is a step that's very intensive also. So now you need to call the basis. That tells you whether you have ACTGs. After that, there are a lot of graph algorithms that are done to figure out the overlaps between the different reads. After that, there's some assembly. You form a draft assembly without mapping it to a reference genome. After that, you map it to a reference genome. You can see that there are different algorithms. And after that, you can polish the assembly. And in the end, you get basically from raw signal data, you get the genome that you're looking for. So it's really a process that you need to go through. And you can see that there are many different algorithms. This is machine learning. This is a lot of graph processing. There's a combination of a lot of things over here, actually. Some people are doing the read mapping using graphs also. And these other parts are actually a combination of multiple different algorithms over here. So it's really a combination of many different algorithms. For example, if this is the bottleneck for some reason, sometimes this is the bottleneck actually, although I think that should be solved going into the future, you may want to have machine learning accelerators in your device to accelerate this. So it's not only in self-driving cars, but also in your genome sequence analyzer that you carry in your pocket. You may want to have these machine learning accelerators. You may want to have graph processing accelerators for this, and you may want to have read mapping accelerators like what we've been discussing to accelerate this step. In a sense, the future is very heterogeneous. If you really want to push the boundaries of efficiency and performance, you really want to accelerate all of these. And we're actually going to touch a lot of these different things in this course. Okay, but this paper, it's a relatively early paper, it analyzes all of these steps and looks at the tools and what kind of algorithms they employ. It also does a lot of empirical measurements about which parts are really bottlenecks and what kind of combinations of tools are good with each other, how do they scale. It's actually a very messy study to do because you can imagine you can have many combinations of these tools, right? But of course, that's the state of the art in 2018. Who knows what happens in 2030? Maybe these tools will all be replaced with different types of accelerators. Okay, so this is to give you an idea that what I've described so far is just part of the problem. It's really that. And we haven't even talked about what do you do after this, right? We haven't even talked about you now have the full sequence, DNA sequence. Now you ask questions to it. Now that requires a lot of other algorithms also. For example, is this patient vulnerable? to this particular drug for some reason, right? Will they benefit from this? That requires other algorithms now. Okay, so let me pull back. This was our dream, right? This was in 2007. We wanted this embedded device that can perform comprehensive genome analysis in real time within a minute. The question is, how far are we from this dream? Still very far, which is good for research, which means that there's a lot of opportunity in this area. Still a long way to go. Why? Energy is a huge problem. Performance is a huge problem. Latency. We haven't solved the performance problem yet. 300x, sometimes 1000x. Sometimes you hear numbers like 15,000, 20,000, 30,000. I'm very skeptical of those numbers. Usually when you get 30,000x with a single change, it's either that you have a bad baseline or you're the first one working on this problem. Clearly we're not the first ones working on this problem. But imagine guess how you could get 30,000 or 50,000x, right? Remember Amdahl's law. If you need to get 50,000x, you really need to be speeding up a program by a lot. Okay, so always question the big numbers that you get. I think in our experience, over all of these algorithms combined, I don't think we can even get 1,000 on the average case. Okay, that's my... Basically, this is similar to what we will discuss in multiprocessors. Whenever you have a multiprocessor, remember we talked about superlinear speedup in one of the lectures earlier. Whenever you see a big number, be very skeptical. Can you really get that big number? Or what is the reason why people are really getting that big number, right? Usually it's because of an unfair comparison, bad baseline, or they really have a truly genius insight. And I've seen all. I'm not suggesting that it's biased in one way or another, but I've seen all possible cases, but you've got to be careful with the large numbers. Okay, so security is another issue that we haven't really talked about actually, like privacy. If you have this device, how do you keep it private? But I think in the end, all of these are basically bottlenecked by memory. Based on our experience, if you want to get more performance, more energy efficiency, you need to get a better memory system. And if I believe actually, we haven't really looked at this yet, but I believe if you want to get better security and better privacy, you also really want to look at the memory system. Because a lot of the privacy issues and security issues that we have is about how we deal with data. You store the data in memory or storage system. When I think of memory and storage are actually equal from my perspective. You store your data somewhere, and because you move the data, somebody can do something to it. Right? A lot of the privacy and security issues are because of that. If you can store your data securely in one place and not move it, maybe you don't cause that problem, right? Actually, if you look at Spectre and Meltdown, those are issues that happen because some data is in the cache and some data is not in the cache, and you can control which data can be in the cache and which data cannot be in the cache, and as a result, you can infer what the value of that particular data is, right? If you didn't have that cache hierarchy, if you actually had a very flat hierarchy, and if you eliminated a lot of those performance differences in terms of accessing data, maybe you could get rid of that Meltdown and Spectre problem, right? That's a very different way of thinking about it. I don't think there's a lot of research in this area, but it's really fundamentally about data and how you access data and whether you move the data or not. So I think security is also really a memory problem in the end. Okay. So we will, as I said, we will have a longer lecture on this, but if you're very impatient, you can watch my video on this topic. It's a longer video than what I just described, although I go into a lot more detail. So this is, any questions so far? No? Okay, I think people want to take a break, and I agree with that. So let's take a break. Shall we continue? Okay. Some of you had questions about homework and the labs. We'll discuss them tomorrow. Does that sound good? In general, I would like to be relatively flexible with the deadlines. I'd like you to learn as much as possible. So don't stress about the homework and the labs. But it's good for you to do the things during the semester. So don't leave things off for late. I think as one of the emails from one of the TAs indicated. Okay, so we covered this one as a motivator for everything else essentially. Now let's talk about the stuff that goes here. But before I go into more detail into the memory system, now I'd like to give an overview of why is memory so important, especially today and going into the future. And as I said, I think of memory and storage as one subsystem, although they're very different from each other in the way we treat them today. But going into the future, they may look more and more similar to each other, especially with some of the emerging memory technologies like phase change memory that we discussed briefly last time. We're going to talk about that again today, briefly. So why is memory so important, especially today? So I think I'm going to give you a couple of different perspectives: performance, energy, and the scaling, reliability, security perspective that are all related to each other. Actually, all of these are, I think, related to each other in the end, but they have different ways of quantifying them. And I think that later we'll talk about trends, challenges, and opportunities, and let's see how far we go today on this one. So basically, we're talking about this part of the system, main memory and storage. As I said, these things are going to look very, very different. If I'm giving this lecture 10 years from today, I think we may actually have a single memory and storage system together that consists of hybrid technologies, as opposed to having a memory system that's accessible with loads and stores, and a storage system that's accessible through a file system interface today. So today we access them very differently, as you know, but in the future we may access them with very similar mechanisms like loads and stores. Okay, we'll get back to that. Basically, we're going to talk a lot about main memory to begin with, and as you can imagine, this is a critical component of all systems that we have today. Regardless of whatever type of system you're designing, you need to have some sort of working storage. And usually that working storage consists of the DRAM technology that we've discussed last time, dynamic random access memory. In some cases, that's not true. Some systems are very expensive SRAM, but that's very rare in modern systems. And this system, the main memory system, must scale in many, many dimensions if you want to keep growing the processing capability in a system. We want more capacity. We want scalable technology so that we could shrink the size of it and we could still get benefits. We want more efficiency, energy efficiency, area efficiency. We want lower costs, and we want better algorithms so that we can manage the parallelization of it, parallel access to the main memory system, right? And this is true, of course, if you want to maintain the performance growth and the scaling benefits that we've been used to for a long time. And it's also instructive to look at this processors and caches, not just like general purpose processors. You may attach FPGAs. They have very similar interfaces to main memory, actually the same interface to main memory. You may attach a GPU. They have, again, very similar interface to main memory. You may attach a heterogeneous combination of those accelerators, and again, they are interfaced in the same way to memory. As a result, if main memory is a bottleneck, it's really a bottleneck of the entire system. And if you look over here, actually, in a cell phone, for example, you have many different accelerators attached to main memory. Memory control is kind of like the center of the world that arbitrates a lot of requests. And it's really bottlenecking the system today, as we will see. This is another picture that I like using in all my talks, actually. This picture I drew in 2008, I think. And it's still very similar because the paradigm of processor is very similar. How many of you use Xfig today? Does anybody know what Xfig is? X-F-I-G? F-I-G, yes? No one? Maybe Minesh knows? That's all? Really? Okay, Xfig is a program in which you can do drawing. It's a GNU program, and I like it very much because it's very simple. I like simple interfaces, and I drew this with Xfig. If you're interested, you can take a look at it. Maybe you'll find it very primitive, which is probably true, but it's still useful to draw pictures like this. But this is a picture I drew in Xfig, and basically, if you look at this, this shows processing cores, caches, interconnects, other caches, other interconnects, memory controllers, other interconnects, shared memory, other interconnects, and storage. So the takeaway is most of a node, when you look at it today, is dedicated to essentially memory, the memory hierarchy, right? It's memory, it's elements that move and store data. In fact, if you do the calculations, cores occupy a very small fraction of a multi-core system today. It's less than 20 or 10%. If you include memory and storage, of course, it's much less than 10 or 20%. So think of it as a computer. We're calling these things computers or computing systems, but most of the resources are really dedicated to resources that don't compute. They're storing and moving data. So it's good to keep that in perspective. Of course, the question is, does it make sense to design systems this way? Today, everything needs to move into the processing core, and processing core should be interpreted broadly here. It could be a processing core, it could be an accelerator, it could be a GPU core, it could be an FPGA compute core, right? Regardless, most of the system is really dedicated to caches, interconnects, memory controllers, other caches, main memory. So essentially, we have a big memory bottleneck, and it's clear from the way we're designing the systems. Most of the system's resources are dedicated to it. There's another thing that I want to mention over here, which we talked about last time. But if you look at these cores or accelerators, I like calling them agents. These are really agents of computation. They're doing some computational tasks. Whenever they access memory, they interfere with each other. There are some resources that are shared between a subset of these cores. There are some resources that are private. There are some resources that are shared by all of the cores. And whenever these cores need to access memory, need to access data, they interfere with each other in the different resources. And that causes predictability and quality of service problems, which we will briefly talk about and which we will focus on later on. So essentially, memory system is a shared resource. By the way, this picture doesn't do justice to the memory system, because whatever I call core over here, a lot of it consists of the memory system also. If you look at a core, you have computation units, you have register files, you have interconnects, you have private caches, which are not shown here, L1 cache, for example, IND, instruction and data caches. They're all part of the memory system. So only the computational units that you have over here should be considered computing, really. Everything else is storage and data movement. So the problem is actually even worse when you focus on these cores. Even register files are part of the memory system, right? You want register files so that you can exploit the locality that you have in the memory. So, and the compiler or the programmer exploits that locality by putting things that are frequently and recently used into the register file. And that's part of your memory. GPUs, for example, we will talk about GPUs later on, but if you look at a GPU core, a good chunk of it is occupied by a huge register file, because you can execute many threads. The computational cores are relatively simple, because we want to actually not make them complicated, because you have a lot of parallelism. But if you want to actually support many threads, you need to have very large register files so that you can support the thread contexts, and you need a lot of registers per thread. So if you look at a GPU core, a good chunk of it is really the register file, and that's really part of the memory system. That's the right way of thinking about it. And those register files, you cannot do computation inside the register file also. You still need to move the data from out of the register into the computational unit, and then the computational unit does the operation and then writes the result back, right? Even at that very closely coupled computational unit register file level, we're moving the data out of an SRAM structure in this case. But really, data movement is all the way from the storage into the processor cores. Okay, so we'll take a broad overview of the memory system right now. Let me give you that broad stroke first. So there's some, memory system is becoming even more important because there are some recent technology, architecture, and application trends that lead to some new requirements and that exacerbate some old requirements. And we've always demanded a lot from this memory system, and we're going to demand a lot more. If you remember, if you've taken the digital circuits or watched the lectures, there are key requirements, right? There was a slide on ideal memory system. An ideal memory system is zero cost, zero latency, infinite capacity, and infinite bandwidth. Those are the requirements that we have. And that's not enough. Because there are some recent trends that want us to do more, or pushing for example, the quality of service is not discussed over here, right? Of course, if you have ideal for everyone, then quality of service is also solved. Okay, but scaling is not included in that requirement in a sense. So basically, as we know and as we design them today, DRAM technology and memory controllers are not satisfying these requirements, at least all of these requirements, and I'm going to show you evidence during these lectures. And there are some, as we also briefly discussed, there are some emerging memory technologies that enable new opportunities. These emerging memory technologies are non-volatile, like phase change memory, so that you can merge memory and storage. So we will talk about that later in the course also. So given these broad trends, requirements, and some potential opportunities or problems, I believe we need to really rethink the main memory system to fix the issues we're having with DRAM and enable some of these emerging memory technologies while satisfying all of these requirements. And we will see what those requirements are in a slide. And that's exactly why people are focusing a lot into the memory system. Remember the UPMEM picture that I showed you in the in-memory compute engines? There's a lot of work that's going on in-memory computation today, essentially because of these trends, because of the slide, let's say. The slide captures why there's a lot of work going on in the area. Okay, so let's talk about these trends that are affecting main memory. These are the major ones. The first one is about performance and predictability. The second one is about energy. And the third one is about scaling. And as I said, they're interrelated. Let's focus on this first one. So what is performance? Performance is a multifaceted problem. It's not, you cannot pinpoint performance into a single thing, right? Sometimes it's about latency, sometimes it's about bandwidth, sometimes it's about capacity, sometimes it's about how you manage interference between different applications or tasks. So you really need to solve all of them at the same time. And the need for higher bandwidth, higher capacity, lower latency, and better quality of service is increasing today. Now let's take a look at why. There are three major reasons, actually. If you find out some other reason, please let me know. Feel free to contribute. You can feel free to interrupt me, actually, if you think of something. I don't have a problem with that. It's actually good if this is more interactive. So, in my opinion, there are three reasons. One is we have an increasing number of agents in the system. This is clear with multi-core, for example. But this is also true for accelerators. We have an increasing number of accelerators in the system that are there. Machine learning accelerators, video processing accelerators that have been around for a long time, speech processing accelerators, those are all similar to machine learning, of course, right? Video processing is different, of course. It's not necessarily machine learning based. But all kinds of accelerators that we have in the system. And these are increasing. This basically says that we know how to design computational units really well today. And that's actually true. We've made a lot of progress over the decades in terms of the design of the computational units. We really know how to design them much more efficiently compared to the past. And we can stamp them out. We can have many of them. And as you know, we can have many transistors to burn with these computational units. Okay, that's basically the increasing number of cores and agents parts. In the application side, applications are becoming increasingly data intensive. Clearly, I've given you an example from genomics, but true for social networks, for example. There's a lot of data that is really flooding the systems that we have in social networks. That's true for other machine learning frameworks. Whenever you drive a car, you generate a lot of data. If you have a self-driving car, or even if you don't have a self-driving car, you have the potential to generate a lot of data, right? So basically everything we do generates a lot of data today. And applications are becoming increasingly data intensive. And on top of that, we want to consolidate more and more. Basically, if you want to really be efficient, you don't want to dedicate a single node for a single task. You really want to put as many tasks in the node as possible, and then you basically manage the access to the node as much as possible. So this is true in cloud computing, for example. Whenever you design a big data center, you try to get as many jobs as possible and schedule the jobs on a single node so that you can actually get high throughput and high efficiency. So that and that actually leads to more requirements in the node, because now you have more applications running that require more capacity, more bandwidth, better latency, and quality of service becomes an even bigger problem actually in that scenario. We'll talk about quality of service later on, but once you consolidate, you get a lot more quality of service issues. Yes?
About the multi-core one, is
Yeah.
memory parallelizable, or like does it only serve like one agent at a time? Or is this the nodes that you're talking about?
Which one? Multi-core? Or?
Multi-core, yeah.
Okay, so well, memory can serve multiple cores, certainly, right? Because you may have multiple banks in memory, as we will talk about. You can actually parallelize accesses. But sometimes if you have a conflict, if you have two cores that require access to the same bank at the same time, then you get serialized. And there are also serialization points, right? The memory bus is a bottleneck, and that's a serialization point. You have assuming that you have multiple cores accessing the same memory controller, they will collide on the memory bus. Okay. So there's certainly some parallelism, but you'll get serial access as well. Okay. Okay. So these are three major trends. Anything else? I think these are the ones that are really driving the performance requirements up and up. So let's take a look at an example of this. This is data from an ISCA 2009 paper by HP Labs at the University of Michigan. It's a good paper. I would recommend reading it. It'll be up on our website. right? Okay, I think Minesh is taking notes, that's good. It's not a required reading, but I think you get more out of this course if you actually look at these papers. Even if you don't read the entire paper, you may want to look at the abstract. So this paper analyzed empirically what's happening to core count and memory capacity, main memory capacity, over the course of time. And they basically found out that the core count is doubling approximately every 2 years, and DRAM capacity is doubling approximately every 3 years. So both trends are exponential, as you can see, but one trend is much faster than the other one, which means that we can put more cores into a system, then we can increase the memory capacity. So there are clearly implications of this. One of the things that they conclude is memory capacity per core is expected to drop by 30% every 2 years. So this is not good because people always rely on having more memory capacity per thread whenever they write a program, so that they can do more things in a program. Whenever you want to add features to a program, they usually require memory, more memory capacity. And if you're going to have less memory capacity available to a thread, assuming you're utilizing all of your cores, as an assumption here, then you have a problem, right? Essentially, your software will not have sustained improvements as we had in the past. Okay, well that's an interesting conclusion, I think. But whenever you see a graph like this, it's always good to ask the question, first of all, is it correct? I think these guys did a good study, these researchers did a good study, so I think it's correct. But there's a trend also, a projection, right? It's always good to ask the question, is that projection correct, right? That could be asked of the Rader paper that we discussed yesterday also. There was a trend in terms of refresh, right? Is that trend going to continue, or is that trend continuing at this point? I think with Rader it's not continuing. It's not as bad today because people are focused on the refresh problem. It's still a problem, and I think it's the fundamental bottleneck of DRAM, but it's not as bad as what Rader projected because people are solving the problem or trying to solve the problem. The question is, does the trend look the same today? And this may be a good exercise for people. This may be a good homework question, maybe. I don't know. But it's, of course, it requires some data collection analysis of real processors. If you look at the GPUs, actually, the trend is very bad. If you think of GPU cores, I think of this as computation capability versus memory capacity. How much computation capability you're adding into the system, and how much memory capacity you're adding into the system. In the GPUs, we're able to add a lot more computation capability, and we're really bottlenecked by memory capacity. That's one problem. In GPUs, I think the trend is more worse than this. In CPUs, I'm not sure if this trend is continuing. It's good to do that study. Maybe it's not continuing, actually. Maybe we're not putting more cores. Part of the reason is because we're not getting a lot of parallelization out of at least general purpose programs. Whereas in GPUs, people are parallelizing their applications really, really well, as we will discuss when we talk about GPUs. In CPUs, maybe people are not parallelizing very well. And also, I think in CPUs, once you put more memory into the system, you may not be getting a lot of benefits because you're bottlenecked by memory. So there's an interplay between these two trends. Part of the reason why people may not be putting memory into the system is because you're not getting a lot of benefit. Part of the reason why people are not putting more cores into the system today, the trend may not be continuing because people may not be putting as many cores into the system as today, as this trend suggests. Because if you put more cores, you're not getting a lot more benefit, right? Because you're bottlenecked by memory. Okay? But if you look at the overall trend, if you look at the system trend in a system like this, there are actually a lot more cores that are being put and that are pressuring the memory today. So I don't know if this study is done in an SoC, for example, but I believe in an SoC this is much worse. There's a bigger gap between computational capability and memory capacity going forward. Okay, any questions? But it's always good to be critical whenever you see a graph like this. But I think this graph maybe understates the things in some of the domains we have, like GPUs and SoCs. General purpose cores, I'm not sure. Okay, so I think trends are actually much worse for memory bandwidth per core. If you do the study for memory bandwidth, you'll find out that memory bandwidth is not increasing as fast as capacity. Memory bandwidth is increasing by about 10% every year. Now ignore the 3D stacking, which is not very good. Meaning, in the end, the takeaway is we're able to put a lot of cores in a system, a lot of computational agents, but we're essentially starving them in terms of bandwidth and capacity. And this will become a little bit more clear when we look at the trends in a DRAM chip. So these are trends of how much capacity has improved in a given DRAM chip over the last 18 years, ending in 2017. How much the bandwidth of the chip has improved, and how much the latency of the chip has improved over time. So this is actually a very good slide to brainstorm research directions on. So basically, we plotted the most common DRAM chip of the day, DDR interface, which we will talk about later on. Essentially, the most common DRAM device, the least cost DRAM device that you have in the system, that you have in the market. And we're going to look at how much capacity has improved over the 18 years. Now let me give some thoughts. How much do you think capacity has improved for a single DRAM chip over these 18-year time span? Any guesses? Anybody wants to take a guess? Otherwise we're going to stall for some time. Yes, I'm waiting for data from memory right now. Yes?
In 1989, the single chip was around 128 megabytes, I think.
It was very small, basically. Yeah?
64 megabytes, and nowadays it's more like 4 or 8 gigabytes.
Okay.
Maybe 16 for the server.
Okay.
More like that.
So what is the number? More than 100 times?
Yeah.
Yeah, actually that's a good ballpark, you're right. So I'll give you the number. It's basically under 28x. So it's improved very well. So I think that's exactly how you do this study, basically. You look at what is the most common capacity that you have at that point in time, and you basically compare. That's the methodology here. And you can see that this is actually not bad. We can cram more DRAM cells in a given area. That's how we are getting this exponential increase. But you can also see that it's slowing down, right? So this is essentially the indication of the DRAM scaling problem, the third thing that I have on the list. DRAM manufacturers are having difficulty at increasing the capacity at the same rate as before. Yes?
I just want to say the x-axis is not linear.
X-axis?
Yeah, so you have like 4 years.
Yeah, that's right, actually. That's true. It's still an exponential trend, though. Maybe the exponent is not... Oh, I see. Slowing down isn't necessarily true. Well, take my word for it. It's slowing down. That's true. But yes, that's a good point. That's a good point. If you look at the last parts, I think it's actually true, like over here. But yes, point well taken. This is a bad graph. So who's going to make this graph again? I think I'm looking at Minesh over here with my eyes over here. That's good. I like the thinking. So it is slowing down. That is true, but maybe not as bad as depicted in this graph. You had the same point? Oh yeah. Okay. Good. Okay. So this is the least of the problems that we have, actually, because capacity is DRAM manufacturers are designing chips with capacity in mind. That's the main optimization point. Basically, we want to maximize capacity. For some reason, industry has went into that trend. One of the reasons it's very cheap, it's very easy to do that compared to whatever is going to come next. And it's also, the technology is in your favor, actually. The technology enables you to put more transistors in a given area. Any other thoughts? Okay. What about bandwidth? What do you think is happening to bandwidth? And again, ignore 3D stacking, for example, here, where you may have many more connections between the logic layer and memory layers. We're going to talk about that. How much do you think has bandwidth improved? In the most common device. Some of the devices are actually designed for very high bandwidth. I'm ignoring them because they actually make the trade-off in a different way. No? No guesses? So bandwidth is a secondary design consideration in general. It's an important design consideration, but it's secondary to capacity in general in memory, at least in the current mindset. As a result, you get curves that look like this. It's been improving basically 20x, let's say. And bandwidth is interesting because you can improve bandwidth more, but you need to pay more power and you need to pay more money for it. Why? Because there are multiple ways of improving bandwidth, right? You can increase the frequency of the bus that increase your data rate, or you can have more pins in a given chip, meaning that you can with a single access you can get, instead of getting, let's say, 16 bits, you get 1,000 bits. That clearly increases your bandwidth. But now you require 1,000 pins as opposed to 16 pins out of a DRAM device. And these pins are expensive because they are large input-output pads that require very big area as well as very powerful drivers. So bandwidth is also possible to improve at the expense of cost. So there's a trade-off between bandwidth and cost, and bandwidth versus cost and power. And also there's a reliability. So if you want to increase the bandwidth by increasing frequency, how do you keep things as reliable? That's actually a big problem whenever you design very high frequency circuits. Any thoughts? And bandwidth is, again, less of a problem than latency. What about latency? How much do you think things have improved in latency? No thoughts? You don't want me to stall. Less than 10 times?
5 or 6.
5 or 6 times, okay. Any other takers?
I say less.
Less?
Like
3x. Okay. Any other takers? This is good. People are reducing it, as you can see. Anyone who wants to increase it? Clearly I've given you an upper bound, which is 20, right? It's actually much worse. Basically 30%. And this, I mean, there are multiple reasons for it. One is, if you want to improve capacity, this goes against improving latency, as we will see. This is also a very fundamental trade-off. Capacity and latency are at odds with each other. In every design that I've seen, it's very hard to break this trade-off, break this fundamental trade-off, I think. You can try to go around it, as we will discuss when we talk about memory latency. But for example, if you want to improve capacity, you want to string many cells together in a single bit line, in a single wire, which means that your wire needs to be very long. And if you have long wires, that's fundamentally bad for latency, because you need to traverse that wire, right? It has high capacitance, high resistance, long wire. That's the fundamental trade-off, essentially. If you want to reduce latency, you want short wires, so that you can access a cell quickly with a short wire, and it can wire it up to sensing structures quickly, but that causes a lot of area overhead, because now you have a sensing structure per cell, right? That's the extreme. And that area overhead is unacceptable in modern devices. Yes?
But the core is running faster and faster.
Core meaning?
Like the
processor.
Processor.
Yes, absolutely.
But how does it cope with it?
Yeah, it's not coping, as we will see. So basically, you will see that memory is not running faster and faster. Core is running faster and faster. As a result, we have a growing memory bottleneck. Yes?
Is there a reason that there was a change in 2008 between the capacity and the bandwidth, that before bandwidth was doing better than capacity and it switched?
That's a good question. So actually, I'm not sure. Any thoughts, Minesh? Yeah, these trends are sometimes hard to, because they're also relative, right?
Yeah.
In the sense that, so I think if I had to guess, at that point in time, there was a lot of improvement in bandwidth. People actually researched the interfacing into the DRAM quite a bit, and that's probably the reason. And probably that one-time effort put into the bandwidth actually enabled those bandwidth improvements that tapered off later on.
Yeah.
Because those were the times when people were researching something called, does anybody remember Rambus? Rambus is a company let me call it Rambus DRAM. I don't know the technology actually, but basically they came up with a very fancy interfacing technology, interconnect technology, signaling technology that improved bandwidth significantly. And a lot of the manufacturers reacted to that by trying to improve the bandwidth to that level. And there was a lot of mess in the industry because Rambus patented a lot of things. So you can read the history about that. There's a lot of negative thinking about that at this point. The MBOT still exists actually, but they don't design memory anymore. Well, maybe they design memory and they patent it, but they don't actually manufacture memory, as far as I know. So if I had a guess, that would be the guess. There was a big one-time push for better interface technologies at that time. But that's a very good question. I like the thinking that you all have in this course. It's always good to question whatever you see, and that's the most important thing I think that we will get out of this course. Ignore all of the homeworks and everything else. Those are good, of course. You will learn and you will make things better that way. But I think this sort of critical thinking is something that I would definitely like everyone to get out of this course. Yes.
Yeah. So is bandwidth highly related to clock speed in processors?
In processor, you mean the memory bandwidth, or?
Yeah.
Is memory bandwidth is highly related to clock speed in processors?
I was just wondering what the relation could be, because the improvement graph seems to follow clock speed.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Basically, if you overlay the clock speed in processors, how would it look like? It may look somewhat similar, but processor frequency has improved a lot faster actually than memory speed. It's also tapering off, but bandwidth in memory is not just about frequency. It's also about the interfacing technology. But I think what you're getting at is really, is there a supply and demand relationship, right? The processor itself is improving in terms of, maybe the processor itself is not improving, so maybe there's not a lot of effort put into the bandwidth. I don't think there is a direct relationship, because the need for bandwidth from the processor doesn't come just from the frequency, it also comes from the parallelism. For example, in a GPU, the frequency of each core is not as high and it's not improving as fast, but the parallelism is improving very fast, and GPUs are the biggest bandwidth demanders that we have today. And as a result, people are designing specialized memory technologies for GPUs, as we will see later on. But I also like the thinking, so this may be improved by looking at processor trends as well. So I'm looking at Minesh from this way, because he's been doing a lot of these studies in the year. So now he has a lot more ideas on how to improve the slide for the next incarnation of the course. Okay, so there's another thing over here. This is actually really interesting. This latency, why hasn't it been improving? One of the reasons, it's very fundamental. There's a clear trade-off. The second reason is I think there's a mindset in the industry that says capacity, that used to say capacity is very important, and because it's easy to improve, people have focused on capacity a lot. And people are not focused on latency. And when we'll talk about latency, people, I think, have been assuming a lot that latency may not be improving, but we design all of these complicated hierarchies to tolerate that latency, right? So if you think about that, that's how things have been evolving. That's exactly why we had the picture that I drew in XFIG. Most of the system is dedicated to the memory hierarchy. People actually, even though the latency is not improving, you're designing these hierarchies to tolerate it as much as possible, and now you're in the mindset of, okay, this is how things go. So we make as opposed to improving the memory latency where it's really a problem at, let's keep building better hierarchies. Right? That's exactly where the paradigm is. Well, I think it's shifting as we discussed, but that's exactly where the paradigm has been for a long time. Don't improve latency as much, tolerate it in some other way. In GPUs, it's tolerated by massive multi-threading. In CPU, also huge register files, still large caches, large scratch pads, right? They're all trying to avoid the memory latency or tolerate the memory latency. In CPUs, large caches, prefetchers, very large out-of-order execution engines that are sophisticated, right? They try to tolerate the latency by executing instructions out of order. All of these mechanisms are there to tolerate the memory latency. Yet they add complexity to the system. That's not depicted over here clearly, right? There's some complexity in the system that's added. And we will discuss that later on as well. So this is a complicated thing. It's not just about a fundamental trade-off, it's also about a mindset of designing systems. It's also about business in the sense that maybe there is this implicit partitioning of business between computation and memory, right? If you think about computation companies versus memory companies, they have partitioned themselves over decades for historical reasons or for business reasons, and memory companies are there to supply these memories that are essentially high capacity and reasonable bandwidth, but maybe low latency, and it's the task of the CPU or the GPU or the FPGA to tolerate all that memory latency, right? And that's this business. It's also good to question this because this business has been very successful for both of them, but maybe even more successful for the computation companies, in the sense that because they have the processor that they can process, their margins have been very high. So they can actually charge a lot more for the processor, because without the processor you cannot do anything. Whereas the memory business has evolved in a very different way. The margins have been extremely low because the focus has been very much on capacity in a unit that cannot be used actively, meaning you cannot do processing in it. As a result, the margins, meaning how much you can charge the customer, has been very low. And as a result, I think memory companies have kind of constrained themselves to the space where they keep perpetually improving capacity and not thinking about improving anything else, because once your margins are low, they become lower and lower over time. So it's a bit sad in that sense, right? So there's a lot that goes into this equation than just technical concerns. I think technical concerns are first and foremost. They may motivate the initial thing, but once you get into the mindset, and once your business gets rolling with that mindset, it may be very hard to get out. It may require a revolution for you to get out of that mindset. Okay, any other thoughts on this one? We can spend more time on this one, but maybe let's move on. But clearly, this is a performance-related curve, right? Capacity, bandwidth, and latency are all performance things. We're not talking about energy efficiency here yet. But clearly, we also know that on the application side, we need a lot more performance. So these are some applications that are interesting. They're fundamental graph tree. I like graph processing a lot because it's used in many applications, as you've seen in bioinformatics, but also many machine learning frameworks as well. I didn't talk about that, but a lot of machine learning frameworks are based on graph processing, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. But all of these are actually bottlenecked by memory. If you can read a bunch of these papers if you're interested, and they all talk about memory being a big bottleneck. I'll give you some examples of this later on. And it's not just memory latency, memory bandwidth, or memory capacity. Different workloads are bottlenecked by different combinations of these. And in a given workload, sometimes your latency bottleneck, sometimes your bandwidth bottleneck, sometimes your capacity bottleneck. So you really need to solve all of those at the same time. You cannot just say, I improve capacity and this workload will magically speed up. That may be true initially, but then you'll be bottlenecked by latency or bandwidth after that, because that's how really Amdahl's law works, right? You basically solve a bottleneck, and then the next thing becomes a bottleneck after that. And sometimes there's no single bottleneck. It's very hard to quantify, is it capacity, latency, or bandwidth. It's actually very hard to do that study methodically. Okay, so I'm going to talk about these workloads later on also. This is even on the mobile end, systems like this. You have very interesting workloads going into the future also, like machine learning frameworks, right? Clearly everybody uses web browsers, video engines, and these are also bottlenecked by memory, and we're going to talk about that in terms of performance. So I think any interesting workload is bottlenecked by memory, and people try to make workloads less bottlenecked by memory. Usually workloads that have very good access patterns, streaming access patterns, very good locality, those are the ones you can optimize really well. And those are the things that, so you can stage the data into the caches, for example, and you can make your caches extremely effective. And those are the cases where memory is not a big bottleneck in terms of performance. But that requires a lot of effort in terms of the programmer. That's one downside. Quantifying that effort is not easy. And also that doesn't mean that energy is not a bottleneck, because you still need to move the data into the processor, right, to be able to do that. So this doesn't mean that memory is a bottleneck in every workload. We can reduce that bottleneck by exploiting locality, by writing your program so that it fits into the caches as much as possible. But remember, caches are also memory. So taking that perspective is very important. You're still moving data between the cache and the processor. Maybe that data movement is less costly, but it's still costly over there. Okay, so let me give you some historical perspective also. Does anybody know this name, Dick Seitz? Probably not. Maybe Minesh does. I'm picking on Minesh a lot today because he's seen these slides many times before. So Dick Seitz is the chief architect of alpha processors. Does anybody know about alpha processors? Alpha ISA. Nobody was born in 1995. Okay, so Alpha ISA. Alpha was the architecture by Digital Equipment Corporation, which you probably don't know also because it's a dead corporation right now. Essentially, these were some of the fastest processors of their time. They were competing with Intel in terms of how fast they could make the processors. And Alpha is a beautiful ISA actually in terms of instruction set architecture. It's one of the good ISAs from my perspective. Of course, any ISA is idiosyncrasies, but Alpha ISA was a very clean ISA when it was designed. Dick Seitz was essentially the chief architect of some of the fastest Alpha processors of their time. And after they designed the Alpha 21164, he wrote this one-page article, which will be posted on our website, on the course website. It's a one-page article that talks, basically it's titled this way. It's the memory stupid. Basically, it says that they've designed this, they went into a lot of effort designing this processor that's the fastest. The processor is supposed to finish, it has the capability of finishing 4 instructions every cycle. So it's a superscalar. It's an in-order machine, but superscalar. It can finish 4 instructions per cycle. But they did a lot of empirical studies and they found out that the processor finishes 1 instruction every 4.7 cycles. So you can do the calculation, that's worse than 1/18th of the peak bandwidth of the processor, right? Basically, you design this processor and you're utilizing it less than 7%, I think. And essentially, he concludes this, basically. It's really all about memory. And this is a sentence, this is the last sentence he concludes the article with. This is a person who dedicated his life to designing microprocessors. I expect that over the coming decade, memory subsystem design will be the only important design issue for microprocessors. So it's a very strong statement, right? Oh, and he actually, this italics is his italics, not mine. Clearly, I've copied and pasted from his article, right? So this is a very strong statement, and this is actually true, in my opinion, because memory is the big bottleneck. There's actually a good story about. Does anybody know what the story is about? And this, it's the memory stupid. Some people get offended when they see this. It's the memory stupid. They think someone is calling someone else stupid, but there is a historical context. In my opinion, whenever you take some words and quote it like that, people who don't know the historical context get offended. But there's a very interesting historical context here. Anybody? Anybody from the US? Yes?
Is it keep it simple, stupid?
What is the context over there?
That was like an old Navy saying. Like when designing really complex systems, they wanted to keep it as simple as possible. Yeah,
I think there might be some relationship to that also, actually. I'm not sure if this is that relationship, because there's like more closely matching. It's the
economy.
Yes, it's the economy stupid. How do you know that?
No, it's not the economy.
How do you know that? Tell me.
It's the capital. It's from Bill Clinton, right?
It's what?
It's from. It's
Yeah.
one of the voters.
Yeah, exactly. Bill Clinton, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. So you can see the dates over there. So there was a huge election that was going on in the U.S. at that time, and Bill Clinton ran with the sentence or motto saying, "It's the economy, stupid." Essentially, his campaign was all based on the fact that the most important thing is the economy, and they should focus on that. And Dick Seitz, being politically savvy, he actually jumped up on that, and he basically said, used a similar sentence structure, right? Similar phrase structure. It's the memory stupid, right? That's the historical context. I don't know if this is useful, but I think the takeaway over here is the principle is taken out of context, you can be offended with anything. But once things are put in context, historical context, then I think it's good to understand that historical context. Today I see, because of the Twitter, I think there's a lot of criticism that's going on in any word that we see, but I think this is this is the proper interpretation. Keep it simple, stupid, maybe another another inspiration, but I don't know, of course, that one. Okay, anyway, that's the joke part of this. I'm surprised you know that one. I don't think he's that old. Okay, So this is 1990s, right? Okay, let's fast forward. This is based on data that I myself gathered in my PhD thesis. As I mentioned, I worked on run-ahead execution, which is a way of tolerating long memory latencies, which we will talk about hopefully if I go faster in this course. But doesn't matter. I think as long as we get to the insights, it's not a problem. Basically, we analyzed the execution time breakdown of a modern processor with the workloads that Intel was using to design its processors with at the time, around 2002, 2003. And we found out essentially this. And this shows that more than 50% of the time, the processor is waiting for a long latency cache miss to come back. It's not doing any useful work. And this other part, it's waiting for something else. And this other part, it's not stalling. Not stalling doesn't mean it's doing useful work, right? It's doing something, but it may be on the wrong path, right? It may have mispredicted a branch. Actually, if you calculate that, that was not our purpose, but if you calculate that, mispredictions actually consume about half of this also. So basically, most of the time the processor is waiting for memory, even though it's the highest performance processor of its time. Similarly to what Dick Seitz said, right? Okay. Any questions on this? We're going to talk about this later on. This is one of my favorite graphs. And there's something else over here, but I'm not showing that clearly because it's irrelevant to the discussion that we have over here. Okay, so if you don't believe Dick Seitz, well, if you're interested in the paper that has that graph, this is the first paper I wrote, and I'm proud of it. If I had to rewrite it, I would rewrite it very differently today, because after 16 years you have different sort of experience. But I think it's still a good paper. It had its impact. Okay, if you don't believe any of that, since everybody believes Google, right? Google is like God today. Maybe they should change Google to Godgle or something like that. Maybe you can look at the data that they propose. Actually, we should put this as a homework assignment, because I think this is a very good paper that a lot of people should read. This was published 4 years ago in ISCA 2015. And they basically did a very similar study. Of course, it's more detailed, more sophisticated. And they basically looked at all of their data center workloads according to them. And they found essentially the same thing. Basically, the processor is backhand bound, meaning it's waiting for data to come back from memory. And as you can see, the green parts are the only times when the processor is finishing instructions. So only about 10 to 20% of the time, the processor is finishing instructions. The rest of the time, it's stalling. And this is 2015. This is about 20 years after Dick Seitz wrote that paper. So essentially, nothing has changed, right? The processors are getting faster and faster, more sophisticated, bigger, more complicated, higher performance, no question about that, but they're still waiting for data to come back from memory. And this is the performance perspective. And if you look at the Google paper, there's a lot more analysis. You can see this is the cache-bound cycles. You can look at the exact definition of what cache-bound cycles, but I think this caption describes what you want to see. Okay. Any questions?
What is front-end bound?
So I think you need to read the paper for more detail, but there are also stalls that happen in the front end. One of them is because you have a branch misprediction and you're on the wrong path. Essentially, you're not retiring instructions because of that reason. You're not waiting for data from you may be waiting for data from memory, but it doesn't matter because you're waiting for data that you really don't need. So that's. But also, it could be that you cannot allocate a register file, register for a given instruction because you run out of your registers inside the processor. Those are front-end bound, but those are easier to solve problems in general. I mean, they're still significant, as you can see, but they're not as significant as memory. Okay. Anything else? Okay. So let's move to the next one. The next one is about energy. The first one was about performance. I mean, the next one, actually, this previous one is also about energy in a different sense, right? Basically, while waiting, you're consuming energy. And that's really wasting a lot of the resources. But let me quantify the energy in a different way over here. So basically, main memory energy and power has always been a concern, but it's becoming worse today. This is a paper by IBM. Charles Laferge and others wrote this nice paper in IEEE Computer which also will be on our website. Basically, this paper analyzed the energy consumption of IBM's big iron servers. These are big machines that IBM used to design. They still design it, but they design in new generations. They basically analyzed where energy goes in those big servers, and they found out more than 40% of the energy spent on the off-chip memory hierarchy. And in about 2000s, early 2000s, the off-chip memory hierarchy consisted of off-chip caches, off-chip DRAM, off-chip storage, and off-chip interconnect. A lot of things later went into the processor, meaning off-chip caches are now in the processor. IBM still has some caches that are really off-chip because they like these huge caches. They run these huge transaction processing workloads that benefit from huge caches. And they also sell these machines for a lot of millions of dollars. That's why they can afford having these huge off-chip caches still. But recently, the same folks, or a subset of the same folks, have done a study on IBM's Power 8 systems. And they found out that more than 40% of the power of the system is spent just in DRAM. So essentially, if you compare these studies somewhat hand-wavily, I will say, because they're not the exact same system. But now DRAM is consuming a lot more power in the system, because just 40% of the system power is in DRAM. Right? That's true for some GPU studies also. There are other papers that show GPUs consume more than 40% of the power in the system is consumed by the DRAM. So you can see that a significant fraction of the power is spent on the memory hierarchy. And you know that part of the reason, at least, is because DRAM consumes power even when it's not used. Right now, this thing is consuming power because it's doing self-refresh, right? So part of this power is because of refresh, but part of its power is because of leakage. Part of it, the power is because of whenever you're accessing it, you need to do. So when you're accessing it is actually when you consume the most power, because you need to power up all of the circuits, and you spend a lot of energy to move the data. And let's take a look at the cost of that energy in data moment. Basically, these are slides. This is a slide from Bill Daly's High-Peak keynote, which I had hosted, by the way. I don't know why this is flickering. Is there a solution to this? You feel that flickering also? Okay. Okay. Let's try with a better, with a more fortified connection. So basically, in this slide, Bill analyzes how much energy is spent on different operations in a chip. And you can see that this is a 64-bit double precision floating point operation. It costs about 20 picojoules with some technology assumptions, of course. And a DRAM read or write, it's about 16 nanojoules. That's like 800x, right, difference, assuming you believe these numbers. And you should believe these numbers, but you should always be skeptical how those numbers change over time. People try to optimize DRAM accesses, but it's still not as good as we would like. Also, there are some numbers over here that I don't show, like going from this end of the chip to this end of the chip is, I think, 1 nanojoule over here. So as your chip becomes bigger, this also becomes a problem, right? Even data moment inside a chip. So think about that wafer scale chip. Yes, we want to put maybe more memory in a wafer scale chip, and your chip becomes 1 trillion transistors. But if you need to move data from one end of the chip to the other end of the chip, that's going to consume a lot of power and also performance. So there's no free lunch in that sense. You still need to deal with the data movement inside a big chip. And this is data based on a small chip, as you can see, right? It's 20 millimeters, so it's 400 square millimeters. Let me try to do this. I don't understand what's going on here. Does anybody have an idea? No? Okay, we'll see if it is better. We'll do some profiling. Okay, so later, of course, people improved this 16 nanojoules. I think that it's not as bad as 800x today. It's actually closer to maybe 100, 200x, but it's still a lot. There's a huge difference. And if you actually think a little bit historically, remember, as an architect, it's always good to try to look backward. It's hard to do this study, but if you go back, let's say 70 years ago or so, this was more expensive than a memory access in terms of both energy and performance. Basically, doing this complicated operation cost maybe 1 or 2 orders of magnitude more than a memory access. So over time, things have changed. Why? Because logic became a lot more efficient, right? Because of technology scaling and Moore's law and Dennard scaling, which enabled us to reduce the voltage as much as possible to do these operations. This has become much more efficient over the course of 70 years or so. Now things are changing a little bit actually. This may not become even more efficient going into the future, because we've come to a point where we cannot reduce the voltage even more. Because once we reduce the voltage, we run into reliability issues. And you need to overcome those reliability issues somehow. And usually overcoming those reliability issues requires adding more circuitry. So, which means that adding more energy, right? So voltage scaling is not helping us as much. This is called Dennard scaling. I don't know if you heard of Dennard. How many of you heard of Dennard scaling before? Okay, I briefly mentioned that in the first lecture, but this is based on Bob Dennard's analysis of technology scaling. It basically says that over generations of technology, you can reduce the voltage and you get performance improvements and energy improvements at the same time. That's the high level. Of course, there's a scaling theory that talks about how much reduction in voltage you can get and how much energy reduction that enables. I'm not going to cover that at this point. Bob Dennard happens to be also the inventor of the DRAM circuit in 1965. But that scaling theory says that over time you can reduce the voltage, and that improves your energy efficiency, that improves your performance as well. But if that's ending, then we're going to have trouble with this one as well. So that's why I think things may change a little bit. But this is also very fundamental, because Dennard scaling applies to DRAM as well. So it's not, if you cannot reduce voltage here, you cannot reduce voltage here as well. So it's not, this disparity is actually coming from a lot of the interconnects over here, because you need to access these huge interconnects to get data out of DRAM. Interconnects inside the DRAM chip, I/O pads outside the DRAM chip, interconnects going into the chip over here. You're consuming a lot of energy. Okay, any questions about this? I think, as I said, whenever you see a picture like this, you should always question, are these numbers still true? I think the numbers are not as bad, but in the future they may change also, so keep it in mind. For example, I think I mentioned this, but there was a session in machine learning accelerators in the Design Automation Conference in June, and people were giving out numbers in terms of their machine learning accelerators, and one person gave the number 160x in terms of that's essentially the amount of energy, relative amount of energy consumed in a single DRAM access compared to I'm not sure if I remember exactly what was the number of bits that they used, but I believe it was 16 bits. In a 16-bit floating point multiply and accumulate. So 160x is still very high, right? So you should always question whether you really want to bring the data into the chip to do the processing. Okay, so this is a paper that we are going to talk about later on, but this is a study that we have done with my PhD student Amirali together with Google on the workloads that are used in the consumer devices, the 4 workloads that I showed you: Chrome browser, TensorFlow, inference engine, and the video encoding and decoding. And we found out, based on our study, that more than 60% of the entire system energy in a mobile system like that is spent on data movement, moving data across the hierarchy. And again, this is similar to what we've seen in performance, right? It kind of correlates. You're moving data across the hierarchy, 60% of your energy spent on that. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Keep this in mind. It's always good to do these empirical studies to analyze where energy and performance is spent. And today, clearly we have a bottleneck in memory. Any questions? That may be a required reading sometime later. It's a very empirical study of the current workloads. Just like the Google study is the data center study from Google that I showed you earlier. Okay, on top of this is the third major trend. DRAM technology scaling is ending. Maybe this is a strong word, but I've shown you the paper from Samsung and Intel, 2 companies that don't normally write papers together. Right? They also are saying this is becoming difficult. And actually people in industry use even more stronger terms sometimes because this is not very easy to scale. Basically, you have a cell, you have a feature size of the cell, and you want to scale that to lower and lower nanometers. And we've been scaling it so well so far, that's essentially enabling the capacity improvements. And this institution, ITRS, which doesn't exist anymore, it's transformed into something else, but International Technology of Roadmap of Semiconductors, they project what would be the scaling of different types of technologies over time. Their reports are sometimes interesting to read, or were interesting to read. And they've been projecting for a long time that reducing the size of a DRAM cell will not be easy into the future. They basically say, whenever they publish a report, they say DRAM will not scale easily below X nanometers. Clearly they don't say X, they put a number over it. But clearly I don't want to change my slide every time they change their report. That's why there's X over there. It's a fundamental coherence problem. Coherence is also very fundamental, right? Whenever you share data from some source, and somebody else updates that data, you need to update your own copy of the data. So in this case, my slide needs to be kept coherent with somebody else's update of a document. And clearly I don't want that. That's why I put X over there. If you could do that in computing systems, that could be nice also, right? Maybe there's an idea over here to be pursued in terms of handling coherence in computer systems, right? You don't know the value of this data, but you kind of know that somebody's going to update it. I don't know. Okay. So it's good to, I think, keep thinking about different kind of approaches to coherence. Okay. So does anybody know what's this feature size of a DRAM cell today is? In a cutting-edge DRAM technology, what is the cell feature size? Feature size is the dimensions of a cell, essentially, one dimension, let's say. Anybody? No one? Should we stall? Anybody wants to take a guess? Yes? 20 nanometers. That's very close, actually. That's pretty good, I think. I'll take it. So I think in the cutting edge technology, it's probably around 19, 18, 17, somewhere around there. So you're very close to that. So we'll get back to that. Because we're going to compare that number to some other number. We're going to assign a value to X in a couple of slides, actually in the next slide. So scaling clearly has provided many benefits. As you reduce the size of a cell, you get higher capacity, lower cost, lower energy, assuming that not scaling continues, right? What we've discussed continues. Well, you certainly get higher capacity. That's true once you reduce the size, but you may not get lower energy if the not scaling doesn't continue. Okay, so let's talk about this scaling problem. Essentially, this is the DRAM device, and this was the value that was assigned to X by ITRS in 2009. When they were doing projections, they said that reducing the size of the circuit below 35 nanometers is challenging. But we just discussed that today. We're at 18 nanometers, let's say. Let's pick a number. So clearly, we've gone much below that. And clearly, industry has a motivation to go below that. But this actually is true. It has been challenging. It has come at a cost. And we will discuss a bunch of these costs later in this course. Actually, in the next lecture. But a little bit in the later part of today's lecture as well. So as you reduce the size of a cell, your capacitor size reduces and your access transistor size reduces. And because both sizes reduce, your reliability also reduces. Right? Remember the cell that we discussed last time? Your capacitor must be large enough for reliable sensing, and your access transistor must be large enough for low leakage and high retention time. As you reduce the size of a cell, both of these properties become difficult to maintain. As a result, we have scaling difficulties in DRAM, and this becomes hard to scale. Let me talk about charge-based memory. This is actually, DRAM is charge-based memory as we discussed. And as you reduce the size of the cell, reliable sensing becomes difficult. And this is true for all charge-based memories. Actually, this is true for all memories, but it becomes much worse for charge-based memories because you can only have so many electrons, right? If you have resistive devices, you have some more headway potentially, depending on the resistance ranges that you have when you actually change the storage unit size. Usually you start with a big resistance range. When you reduce the storage unit size, your resistance range becomes smaller. So you still have a similar problem, but not as bad as charge-based memories, because charge-based memories fundamentally are limited by the number of electrons that you have in the capacitor, or in the floating gate in flash. If you have time this semester, we'll talk about flash memory also, which is fascinating technology that's used in all devices that we have today, like SSDs, right? But they also have this problem. Why am I talking about this? Because some emerging technologies don't necessarily have this problem. The resistive technologies. We'll talk about that. But let me talk about this reliability problems. Let's quantify these reliability problems a little bit. This is based on a study that we have done about 4 or 5 years ago now what we did was we analyzed the memory errors that happen in all of Facebook's servers at that time. And Facebook has a lot of servers. It's amazing. Clearly, it's growing amazingly. How many of you use Facebook here? That's okay. You don't need to be shy. I think more people use it still, interestingly, even though there are a lot of privacy concerns, clearly. But basically, we had a nice collaboration where we analyzed all of the memory errors, and we were able to categorize what kind of chips are used in the servers when they get memory errors. And this is a correlational study. And this shows a correlation between the chip density employed in a server and the error rate that is observed in that server. And you can see that the error rate increases as the chip density increases. It's correlational because the servers are employed in production, and this is what we see in production servers. But clearly there's a positive correlation between chip density and error rate. And the conclusion is that these chips are less reliable. That's the reason why we get this higher error rates. And we try to isolate the reasons, of course. You can read the paper, which I'm going to reference in the next slide for more detail. Essentially, as DRAM capacity increases in a chip, the cells become closer to each other, and this introduces a lot of noise. The cells also become smaller, and they also become closer to each other. This increases the interference as well as the noise that you have in the cells, and that leads to higher memory errors. So whenever you see a picture like this, it's also good to question this. How do you actually get these numbers? I'll defer you to the paper, because this is also not an easy study to do, right? Because as I said, you cannot take the same server and plug it with some other memory while it's running in production. So you really need to normalize the numbers somehow across these different servers where you observe the errors on. That's why it's a relative server failure rate. It's not an absolute server failure rate, because the populations of these are actually smaller also. So it's not an easy study to do in the end. You'll need to do this well. Okay, any questions on this? This is just one of the data points that is in this paper. There are also other data points in the paper. One of the data points is a small fraction of memories or servers cause a large fraction of the errors. So I think in the study we found out that about 20% of the servers are responsible for maybe 80 to 90% of the errors that you see in the system. So there are clearly some weak population of memories that are out there in production. It's interesting. I don't even remember right now, but at the time we were writing the paper, Facebook didn't allow us to write how many memories that we used and how many servers that we tested, because they were worried that that would affect their stock price if we put that information out. Because that would give indication of how big their fleet is in terms of servers and in terms of memory. But I think maybe they should be more worried about these privacy issues that are around. But it's also interesting that people are not worried as much about those privacy issues, right? Like the number of people who are using Facebook is growing, which means that clearly there's a part of the population who doesn't care about any of this, and there's a part of the population who may care about some of this. That's also interesting to see. Okay, so this is the paper that talks about it. You can take a look at it. And we've also been doing studies that are FPGA based, and we're going to talk about that especially in the next lecture when we talk about Rowhammer. And I also briefly talked about this, right? We built these FPGA based memory controllers that can actually test DRAM, and we can find out different characteristics, right? Retention time, different kind of failure modes, and clearly you see a lot of failure modes in real devices. And if you're interested in doing these studies, this is also open source. Hassan, who's also a TA in this course but who's not here, basically he modernized this infrastructure so that it's easy to use, it's flexible, and you can actually download the code and you can do your testing on real DRAM chips and discover all sorts of errors potentially. And other people in the field are actually using this to discover interesting things, which we may talk about at some point. And that's another paper. Okay, and you know all of this. Well, you don't know this one. I've been talking about this. But basically, the DRAM scaling problem is actually very interesting, because when we first started looking at this problem in 2011 or so, there was no big evidence in terms of the badness of the problem. We've sought for this evidence for a long time. And around 2000, and we actually did the studies around 2012 or 2013, but we found out that you can predictably induce errors in most DRAM memory chips. Does anybody know about this? The DRAM row hammer problem? How many people have heard about this? Okay, some people. Not from me, hopefully. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to talk about that, especially in the next lecture. We're going to focus more on this and go into detail because it's indicative of a lot of other issues that could potentially come up into the future. But this is essentially a simple hardware failure mechanism that can create a widespread system security vulnerability. It could also be a reliability problem. We'll talk about that in the next lecture. But I think more of a security problem than a reliability problem. Essentially, you can flip bits in DRAM by just accessing them, which should not happen. But it does happen, and we'll give the story of it next time. And as a result, people are writing articles that look like this. I like this one because I think this title captures it very nicely. Forget software, now hackers are exploiting physics. And this was published by Wired a few years ago. And this essentially gets to the heart of the problem. Essentially, you have a physics problem at the very bottom that causes you to flip bits in a predictable manner, because whenever you access a row, you're actually affecting some other rows, because there's not enough electrical isolation between the rows, which is really a fundamental physics problem in the end. And as a result, you can exploit that to take over a system. But we will talk about that tomorrow. But if you want to prepare for it, you can read this retrospective paper, but I don't expect anyone to read it. This may be a reading assignment at some point. We wrote this paper with Jeremy, who's a TA. He was here somewhere, right? Okay, I should go fetch him sometime. But basically, this talks about a lot of the research that has been done on row hammer in the past 5 years or so. Okay. So it's not just row hammer though. I think there are other issues like retention issues that we've discussed last time. DRAM scaling has become increasingly difficult already. And there are a lot of papers written on it. Some of them have empirical data, some of them don't have empirical data. So as a result, it's difficult to significantly improve capacity and energy. And as a result, emerging memory technologies are very promising. Emerging DRAM technologies as well as emerging non-DRAM technologies. Like 3D stacked DRAM is very interesting. That gives you higher bandwidth. Reduced latency DRAM is always very interesting. But how do you get it at low cost is important. Low power DRAM is becoming, I believe actually all kinds of DRAM is going to go through the low power direction somewhat, even though it may not be optimized only for low power. That's very important. And non-volatile memory, which is bucketed into this category, although there are many, many versions of non-volatile memory that people are exploring. That's also interesting. And this could buy you even higher capacities than DRAM can afford, as we've seen in the first lecture. But the downside is the picture is not like a single-sided like this, right? These technologies don't only have greens, they also have reds. Basically, that's where the opportunity also comes in. Essentially, you have a picture that looks like this. There's no technology that's good at every single metric that we want. In the end, technologies are always offer trade-offs. For example, it's very interesting actually. It's good to know the history a little bit also as an architect. STT-MRAM, for example, is an interesting technology. It's spin torque transfer MRAM. Like 5 or 6 years ago, some people were saying this is the best technology you can ever get, meaning it's good at every single metric. Quickly, people figured out that there's a huge trade-off associated with it also. So whenever people come up with these technologies that's good at everything, we should always be skeptical as an architect. It's very hard to. Some of these trade-offs are so fundamental that you cannot get every single thing. Every single metric green in a single technology. I think that's another takeaway probably from today. Whenever you're presented with something that's better than sliced bread, don't believe it. I'm not sure if sliced bread is the best thing anyway, but that's how the expression goes. Okay, so as a result, I think a major trend right now in computing architectures is this. Actually, this is again a fundamental thing. Whenever you see a picture that looks like this, different things, good at different greens and bad at different reds, think about heterogeneity. And this is essentially heterogeneity or hybrid systems. Basically, people are putting together different types of memories in a single node so that they can take advantage of the greens of each technology as much as possible while avoiding the reds of each technology as much as possible. And how do you do that? Basically, this requires hardware-software cooperation. You design the hardware, the memory controllers, maybe even the CPUs, maybe even the caches, and the software to manage data allocation and movement to achieve the greens as much as possible while avoiding the reds as much as possible. That's the idea of a hybrid or heterogeneous main memory system. We'll talk about that later on. But this is definitely a trend, and I think this trend is not going to go away anytime soon. For example, we will have 3D stacked memory to provide high bandwidth, low latency, high energy, and low capacity. Of course, the last two are the reds, the first two are the greens. But that's not enough because of the reds. And then we may have some other memory, not just phase change memory, but maybe some other DRAM technology that's high capacity and low power, but it's relatively slow and relatively low bandwidth, right? Now you have a trade-off between these two different technologies, and you may actually have 3 different technologies, right? This is also happening, I think, in 3D XPoint. You have some DRAM over here, and then phase change memory-like technology, 3D XPoint over here, which looks kind of similar to this, actually. So this is already happening. So I think this is one of my first foreshadowing, because we're going to talk about intelligent controllers quite a bit, especially in the early parts of this course. We're going to combine computation and memory a lot. If you have a system that looks like this, I think you need to have some sort of intelligence in the memory controller, some sort of capability in the memory controller so that it understands the characteristics of the data, such that it can help you place the data in the right technology that would match the characteristics of the data. So if you're accessing something very frequently, it may be a good idea to put it over here, for example. If you're writing to something very frequently, it may be a good idea also to put it over here, because this technology, in this case, has an endurance problem, which means that whenever you write to it, it wears out. Just like flash technology. Flash technology also wears out whenever you write to it. So having an intelligent controller can help you identify what should go where. I think this is one of my favorite examples of why we need intelligent controllers going forward, and people are designing these controllers today. Okay, you know this paper. I briefly talked about it last time. Basically, this paper was written by Intel and Samsung, so it's not just, I like referring to this paper because it gives you evidence from the field, not necessarily empirical evidence, but at least a perspective evidence from the field. 2 companies saying that DRAM process scaling is becoming difficult. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but one of the solution directions is going to be this one, having intelligent controllers. This is an orthogonal issue which we briefly discussed. Essentially, if you have all of these problems that we've discussed are there, main memory may scale or may not scale, it doesn't matter. As long as you're using multiple cores and you're treating main memory as a shared medium, you need to handle the memory interference somehow. And that's another reason to have intelligent memory controllers, because memory controllers are the agents that are helping with that interference, right? Basically, as we've discussed last time, uncontrolled interference leads to quality of service, fairness, and performance problems. And this problem is also getting worse. If you look at this picture over here, you have heterogeneity in the devices or computation units. You have heterogeneity inside the hierarchy, different types of sharing, different types of levels of caching. You have heterogeneity in the memory system. And now we have these memory controllers that we need to think about. And that memory, actually that system looks kind of like this, except this is much more sophisticated. Maybe it doesn't have hybrid memory at this point, but it will have hybrid memory soon. Basically, this problem is getting worse because now you need to somehow allocate the resources, memory resources, to these heterogeneous agents to mitigate the interference and provide predictable performance. And that's essentially why memory is becoming more important, and memory controllers in particular are becoming more important. I think this is a very good slide to end with. Basically, if you have a system that looks like this, you also need intelligent memory controllers, because you need to somehow satisfy the requirements of all of these different devices. And imagine a system that looks like this in a self-driving car. And I believe this is going to happen a lot more. People are going to start to consolidate more and more in a single system in a self-driving car. And they're going to run into a lot of problems when they try to do that. Any questions? No? Any thoughts? I think that's a good place to stop. And then we'll pick up from here, and then we'll cover Rowhammer tomorrow. And I'll see you tomorrow then.